and welcome to the Origins Podcast. I'm your host, Lawrence Krauss. Robert Sapolsky is a genius, or so says the MacArthur Foundation when they gave him a genius grant. Whether he's a genius or not, I've known him personally and of his work for many years and have always been impressed by both the depth and breadth of his work. You can tell how accomplished a scientist he is by how many departments he's a member of at Stanford. He's a professor of biology and neurology, and I think neuroscience, and who knows what else at Stanford University. And he's worked on primates and neurobiology and a host of other things. Wrote a great book called Behave, and he has a new book out, and the new book is called Determined: The Science of Life Without Free Will. When I heard about it, I wanted to speak to Robert. We've been for years trying to set up a time to talk in general about aspects of neurobiology, and this seemed like a good starting off point. And I got to read the book before it came out, and it's a long book, and for me it was a challenge initially because as someone who recognizes that there is no such thing as free will based on the laws of physics, and has seen a host of books that I find rather tedious about free will by people I've known, I was a little worried about reading this, but I knew that Robert always has gems to share. And the book is chock full of his own perceptions. It's fun, just like he's fun. And one can learn a lot about neurobiology and then discuss the important question of, once you accept that there is no such thing as free will, he really takes on head first the more difficult question of what do you do about responsibility and guilt and blame. So in any case, we did what I love to do on the Origins Project, and we talked about his own origins, and he and I shared more things than I knew about, and then we had a rollicking discussion of many aspects of free will, neurobiology, society, and consciousness as well, which is a subject I've written about in my new book, and I was happy to see that it passed muster with him, one of the experts. It was a great discussion. He's a remarkable individual and really fun to listen to and talk to. So I hope you'll enjoy listening to it and watching it ad-free on our Origins Project podcast on our Critical Mass website, where paid subscribers will get to see the whole podcast ad-free. Of course, you can listen to the podcast on any site that podcasts can be listened to. And then eventually the video will come up on our YouTube channel, on our Origins Project YouTube channel as well, a few days later, usually. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I certainly hope that you will be as thrilled and pleased and entertained and educated as I was when I had my dialogue with Robert Sapolsky. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Robert. We were saying before I pressed the record button that we're amazed we actually never have been in the same room to our knowledge. We've crossed paths intellectually, and as you know, I admire and respect you tremendously. So it's such a thrill to finally, after all this time, be able to have a long discussion. So thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me on. The respect is mutual.
That's great. I appreciate it. This was no easy task. In fact, it's probably this was one of the hardest things I've had to do for many reasons. I want to talk about your new book, which by the time this airs will be, I'm going to try and time it to the airing of your new book. I have a pre-production version. Your book, Determined, about free will. One of the hardest things for me, it was not an easy task to work through it for a variety of reasons. There's a lot there, first. But also, I come into this with the absolute conviction from everything I know saying there's no such thing as free will. So it was hard for me to, accepting this fact. I thought, well, given that I don't, think there's free will, why am I really motivated to go through this? And that was hard at the beginning. But of course, what's great is that our reasons for my a priori reasons for not thinking there was free will, or sort of are almost not orthogonal, but don't have much overlap. You actually know how the brain works, or at least a lot more than I do. And so your arguments really were quite useful. I don't think I needed them. I accept because basically you and I both don't think there's a magic somewhere in the middle, and that's really what you need, as we'll talk about. So that was one of the reasons I found it hard. But the other is there's a lot in this book, because this book covers so many different interesting things. And that was the other part. I love your mind. I've always loved your mind. I love your writing and the way you think. And it was hard because it's a joy to read. I wanted to skip parts and I couldn't. and the footnotes, of which there are tremendous. I as a rule, I try not to read footnotes in books, but I read every footnote here because, of course, the footnotes are where you get to put on all the stuff where I really get to see how your mind works. In any case, it was worth the effort, and I hope this discussion will be worth people's effort, because we're really going to go. We're going to dig down and deep into the ideas as well as summarize them. But this is an origins podcast, and I like to find out about people's origins. I'm particularly interested in yours. What led you to the remarkable long and winding road that you've taken, with so many branches, almost like the emergent complexity of a neural system, as we'll talk about. So I've read a little bit of your biography as much as I could find, and I found out your father was an architect, okay, and that clearly, and he was an Orthodox Jew. Your mother was, I assume, as well.
The more we learned, the more we realized coerced.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Oh, interesting. Was she also? He was from Eastern Europe. He came from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, he came over just after the revolution as a young adolescent. A very good time to get out of that area.
Yeah.
She came over from the old country as a fetus, so
okay.
She didn't remember as much stuff back there as he.
So she was born in the States.
Yeah.
Okay. And okay, so that. But now, I want to find out a little bit. I mean, and you were brought up as an Orthodox Jew. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, and one of the things I was born as a sort of in a secular Jewish household, and brought up in that way. Where the only thing I learned, my mother kept telling me about being Jewish was that learning was a big deal, and reading. She tried to convince me that was a big part of the religion, but you obviously love learning and reading, and of course, a lot of it's probably hardwired. But who had the biggest influence? So obviously your father had influence because you write about him. But I'd like to learn about your mother too. Who, for example, as an architect, when you were a kid, I know you've loved gorillas right away. But what got you interested in that? I don't know that, and I'd like to.
I'm not trying to get into too murky and quicksandish of just for psychotherapy. But I was like 8 when my mother started taking me to Museum of Natural History, and it was an incredible percentage of field biologists I've encountered who, instead of growing up out in the bush and whose parents were missionaries or researchers, they grew up in some urban, and at some point they stumbled into the Natural History Museum, and that was it. That's the day they imprinted on geckos or whatever. So we went into the primate exhibit somewhat randomly, and if you ever go in there's this stuffed mountain gorilla, right at the entrance. It may not be at the entrance anymore, but he's been on their postcards forever. He was shot by Carl Ackley in 1912, probably with Teddy Roosevelt as his gun bearer. But it's this diorama of this taxidermed mountain gorilla silverback, and something clicked. And if I'm going to get all fuzzy here and stuff, both of my grandfathers died more than 50 years before I was born, kind of thing. I never knew anything about. And something on some visceral level. This just seemed like this would be the greatest grandfather on earth. And I just wanted to go live inside the diorama. I think that's that's what was going on there.
That's where it came from. Okay, I was wondering, there had to have been something, because where you grew up in New York, and there's not a lot of silverback gorillas, at least non-metaphorical ones. And
That's why I wanted to live in the diorama.
yeah,
I don't know about you, but
and
I'm still trying to come to terms with the fact that Brooklyn has now become a trendy place to live. It was not then.
yeah, no, it wasn't then exactly. But it gave you that opportunity, which, as we'll talk about, gave you good luck, and had a huge influence. Now I understand where that came from. And you basically did live in that diorama. I mean, you willfully chose, as soon as you could, as far as I can see, to actually experience, to go, and for 3 decades to continue to try and live in that diorama at some level, which
Yeah.
it really impressed me and amazed me, and also made me envious in some sense. But
Well, talk about privilege and good luck.
yeah, no, well, but well, but for whatever reason, you took advantage of the privilege, and good luck. Um, I would say it would be grit, but I know better. Um, as
Yes.
we'll get to. Um,
Foreboding.
but so that's interesting. So your mother actually had the biggest influence that way. What about reading? I assume I'm always interested in reading was vitally significant for me, and I'm always interested in what did you read a lot when you were a kid, and if so, did that example come from either parent or no?
Um, oh, I read obsessively, and like I guaranteed I was going to be like kicked in the rear in schoolyard perpetually by, I don't know, in fourth grade, like, who's your best friend essay? And I said, books are my best friend. And oh my God, this kid has no instinct for how not to just beg to be abused and bullied. Um, yeah, books were pretty great. It's tempting to do a whole escapism thing, but I
Yeah.
just part of it was also just getting patted on the head that this was like a nice metric for being a good compliant boy.
Were they available in the house, or or not? I mean, what is that, an example or something you picked up? 'Cause, again, I'm interested just in comparing my notes to myself in some ways. Just
Um, a fair number. It was not quite a book obsessed house, but there was like a decent number there. But once libraries started to be a part of the picture, what we did have, I do you remember the Book of Knowledge?
yeah, of course.
Oh my God, we had the Book of Knowledge. And like I would get up early, like on Sunday morning, and just read the book where you could see like an article in there about like this newly finished ship called the Titanic. And it was like this ancient, it was
Yeah,
fast. It was phenomenal.
yeah. No, it's I love those things. I end up getting a subscription to Book of Knowledge type stuff, the Time Life books of
I'm
science.
life.
Remember that
Yes.
20-volume thing was my first thing. I spent my allowance on it when I was a kid, because there were books in my house, but not not enough for
Not
to
that kind.
yeah, and so
Yeah, one of them would show up like every six, and they smelled so good
yeah,
when they
yeah.
first came out of the box.
I still have them. I just put them up, and I'm never going to get rid of them because they mean so much. There's so that, and of course they're outdated, but that's what's that's what's great about science, is that they're outdated. It actually makes progress.
And they admitted somewhere afterward that that was wrong.
Yeah, exactly. That's being wrong as well. I talk about that in my new book. I think admitting you're wrong and not knowing is a key part of science. Um, Now, okay, so now I see where the sort of background. By the way, as Orthodox Jewish, whether your mother was coerced in or not, did they have plans for you? I mean, my mother wanted me to be a doctor and my brother to be a lawyer, but did they want that kind of thing for you? Did you feel any pressure to be a professional in that way?
Um, frantic, ceaseless, crushing, heartless pressure to become a doctor.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, where my wife and I have like tried to figure out the chronology because it was a long time ago, but we think this is the case. That my father started off in med school, like in the second year of the Depression,
Uh,
and was going to be a cancer, and ran out of money
mhm.
and never finished. Like we've got his like stethoscope and microscope in the back of some closet upstairs
Wow.
from 1930, whatever. Um, there's a couple of possible holes in the story, but at least that can hold together broadly. So he knew how to do drafting. He had gone to Stuyvesant High School in New York and
Oh,
like
okay.
learned how to do that. So he got a job doing that in an architectural firm, and then decided to start going to architectural night school. And before it was over with, he was a professor of architecture kind of thing, but yeah, not quite daily, but not far from about the highest possible calling would be to go like be a doctor and cure cancer.
Well, okay, that's it. Did he talk to you much about? I mean, did he talk to you much about science or his interests, or did not? I mean, no, that doesn't. Kids
Um,
often forget to ask their parents what they're interested in. But
um, they came in sort of frenzied monologues.
yeah,
He was a very, very large presence, but he was not a very approachable one.
uh,
Uh, you know, he'd had a tough time of things, and like he was doing his best.
yeah, yeah. But well, he obviously did. And it's interesting to see that pressure came from a different place. For me, and I've already said this a bunch of times. So I think in different contexts, neither of my parents finished high school, but and for them, it was especially important to be a doctor because it represented, going beyond and and uh, and I again when I got my first, I got a fancy job at Harvard, and I never forget my mother phoned my then wife at the time and immediately said he still can go to medical school. There's still time.
Uncanny.
Yeah, yeah,
I had the same when I was getting like trying to pick where I was going to go have a job. I got an offer from like Cornell Med School.
Mhm.
I'm a neuro there, and said, "Well, I'm considering it and coming back to New York or whatever." And they said that would be a good inside connection if you decide. Oh, that is freakish that you
Yeah,
had.
that's amazing. Oh, I'm glad I brought it up. I wasn't gonna, but yeah, that is freakish. Now, you well, I have to ask you this. Did you learn Swahili? I mean, I know you started to. Did you ever did you learn enough do you still
Yes,
speak it?
I'm terrible at languages, but it was just kind of by force. I became sort of functionally fluent by about my fifth or sixth year there, and all it's done is decay since then. I took Swahili for 2 years in college, and it being the times that it was, the book was entirely written for like African Americans thinking about
Mhm.
root stuff. So
Yeah,
it was mostly like learning how to talk about Charlie Parker in
yeah.
Swahili, stuff
Oh,
like
okay.
that.
Well, at least
And it turned out the instructor was Tanzanian, so I learned Tanzanian Swahili, which is like showing up in the Bronx speaking the Queen's English or
oh yeah,
something to
yeah.
Kenya. But I was eventually able to get by, but I'm pretty bad at languages.
I should have pointed out. I mean, people may wonder if who don't know why I even brought that up, but you actually decided when you were still a teenager, early a teenager, that in addition to learning about, if you wanted to learn about gorillas, you would learn. So you started to learn Swahili when you were in your early teens, right?
Um, yeah,
Yeah,
basically,
that's
and
driven.
I was writing fan letters to various primatologists when I was in high school, and eventually got to sit at the feet of one for 4 years, and that was a major disappointment. But yeah, I sort of was intent. I think I had to have been the only like Jewish kid in Brooklyn in the 1970s, sitting on the West Side Independent train, the B train, reading a biography of Jomo Kenyatta day after day.
Yeah, that would have gotten some. It would be interesting to see what would happen today if you were doing that. And it's a different world. But you went, so that it was kind of natural then to major. You went to Harvard, right, and did biological anthropology,
Yeah.
and and that's sort of, I guess, biological anthropology. I'm wondering why it wasn't like um, uh, more. I mean, biological anthropology is not directly focused on primates. You could have done primatology, and I'm wondering what.
Well, at the time, this was just at the time that like the great sociobiology shitstorm hit. In fact,
Yeah.
it was amazing. It was
Was
amazing.
E.O. Wilson? Did you take classes from him or something? Or
My first semester is when he published sociobiology, and yeah, like spending college like arguing about whether he or Lewontin made sense, and it was incredibly stimulating time. At the time, bioanthro included primatology. They shortly after that, things got bad enough, and there had been enough like drive-by shootings between the social anthro people and the bioanthro people that they split into two departments. But yeah, that was
so you could do
where the
both.
primates were. Yeah.
And it's partly, and as you say, and it's clear. I mean, you are one of the things I admire and I'm jealous of is, I've always liked the idea of being a generalist, and you've been a generalist in a clear way. I mean, achieving levels in a wide variety of fields, and it's nice that you could start that generalization with bioanthro. And
It was a low profile department, so you could get away with like just happening not to take all sorts of requirements and things. And it was nobody paid attention to the department then. It was very quiet. It's sort of around then that I then started my like, am I a neurobiologist or primatologist crisis, because said primatology god at whose feet I was sitting got sick my freshman year. He was fine and everything, but he canceled all of his classes, including a couple I was going to take, and sort of at the last minute saying, maybe I'll take an intro neuro class. They probably have something to say about behavior instead of just us evolutionary biologists. I was blown away by it. And like, ever since deciding, am I a neurobiologist or am I a primatologist? And sort of that was
that. See, you anticipated my question, because I was wondering if you did biological anthropology and you like primates, why you then went to do your PhD in neurobiology, and now that I guess that's the reason. It seemed like a jump, but
and sort of by then the way the totally intellectually fabricated way that I saw them as connected is like I go study behavior and stuff in baboons, and exactly at the point where I would say, wow, what's going on inside? Not going to lesion this guy's hippocampus because like I've known him for years and his mother was great. So I'll go do stuff to rats in a lab, and just when I'm learning about the brain there and saying, I wonder if this works in like real animals out in the real world, I get to go back to the baboons. So they were synergistic. I couldn't decide which.
Yeah, actually, I guess it's because of the love of the baboons or the great apes because I was going to say, I actually just had a discussion with Peter Singer, and who's lovely, interesting to talk to, and we talked about animal experimentation and some of the silly things that have been done in the name of psychology on animals, the torturing of animals that didn't, in order to try and understand how humans work, when it was clear often that if you want to really understand how humans work, you probably should examine humans, and certain torturing of rats was probably not going to give you huge insights into post-traumatic stress syndrome in humans and stuff. But you didn't want, you could have chosen to work on humans, but you just found apes more interesting.
I would say more understandable, but maybe the
Ah,
word is more palatable or more.
ah,
You know, I wanted to get out and do field work somewhere in
yeah,
the middle of nowhere.
yeah. No, I can understand that. I, and in your general, you are lucky to have a position that that actually explicitly demonstrates your generalness. Something again I always wanted, but I didn't always because I wanted to. I started a degree in history and as well as physics, but I quickly learned that the intellectual baggage required me to do a degree in mathematics as well as physics, and that took up all the time. But you have professors in biological sciences, neurology, and this really always amazed me: neurological science and neurosurgery. And my mother would have been very happy if I had been a professor of neurosurgery. But
Whoa, you better bet I trotted that out when I went back for Hanukkah.
yeah,
You know what? You
what?
know,
Yeah.
yeah, I think at one point the neurosurgery department had some sort of visiting committee, and they suggested they needed a little more basic researchers in the department. So I was friends with the chief of neurosurgery who said, "Hey, can we put your name on the letterhead?"
Oh, yeah.
Ever since then, I've been a member of the department. I
Oh,
mean,
that's good. That's I have to say at one point I was vice dean of the medical school at Case Western Reserve for about 6 months, but and I don't think I ever told my mother. I worried about what that would imply, so I don't think I ever told. But it did intrigue me. So you're a professor. I mean, and it's quite appropriate given all of the breadth of the lovely connections you make between neurobiology and behavior of human behavior and behavior of great apes. It is a lovely symbiotic relationship, and I guess it took someone like you to realize that was useful. I'm intrigued that you and I guess I'm intrigued and impressed that among that collection of departments in which you're a professor, psychology isn't one of them. And I was intrigued by that.
um, that's a good question. Nor is anthropology there, although
Yeah.
they've also purged like virtually everyone except the social and cultural anthropologists. So that war has been won there. I don't know. I talk to psychologists. I can occasionally say the right nouns and get away with it. But yeah, clearly some of the stuff I've done has involved my having to like interact with them a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting to me that anyway, you people will see when we talk about the context of trying to address this question of free will, which I want to now move to. You mentioned you obviously you've agonized, I guess that's the right way to put it. You've thought about free will for a long time, obviously. And agonizing, by agonizing, I don't think the agonizing was. I suspect you recognized, like me, that there was no obvious scientific reason why there should be free will. But so maybe you didn't agonize about the science, but you agonized to try and understand how to demonstrate explicitly or address this question. How long have you been thinking about it? Is it an issue that's always bothered you, or?
Well, I think once I started getting acne, that was right around the time when logical things happened. Like I was having all sorts of like angst and the
Mhm.
contradictions of, and during one sort of particularly agitated period, I woke up at 2 in the morning one night and said, "Oh, I get it. God doesn't exist. What's going on?" And then shortly after that was, "Oh, and there's no free will." And that was followed by, "And it's a totally empty and different universe." So that cured everything right there. Adolescent
It
angst,
did
poof,
for me too.
gone.
I didn't. I'm sure I had an epiphany that way. In fact, I meant to ask you that. I noticed at age 13 is when you kind of made had this realization. At least that's what this bio says. Age 13. I I for me it was a gradual thing, but I actually sort of became. I mean, age 13 was when I was bar mitzvahed, and that experience was enough to turn me off religion forever if it hadn't already been that way. Was the age 13 a coincidence for you too, or no?
No, not at all. Of course. I would say just from focusing on the ways in which often ancient and well-established cultures have influenced your life, and in which the purpose of every generation is to inculcate their offspring into the same cultural values. Uh, you know, age 13 is when they're really pressing court on that one.
Yeah.
So that's kind of when inevitably this doesn't make any sense and this isn't right. Suddenly
Now you
starts
mention it,
being.
though, it shows that they understood neuroscience a little bit, because you point out how, in fact, the prefrontal cortex, and I mean, it's that period when things are developing. So if you're going to inculcate, that's probably a really good time to do it.
And especially do it in a way where they somehow make you feel guilty for a pogrom that happened in the 15th century.
Yeah.
So the very least thing you could do right now is make your children messed up with that as well.
Yeah, well, guilt is a huge part of that, I think. But it's interesting when you said you smiled when it cured everything when you woke up in the middle of the night. And I want to follow that up. We'll come back near the end of this 6 or 7 hour discussion to this question, because you almost apologize or make it appear as if recognizing that there's no free will is and should be a depressing thing. But one could often say, and I'm often asked that, I mean, isn't recognizing there's no meaning, no cosmic meaning to the universe and no God also a depressing thing? And we'll talk about its impact on morals, because you talk about that. But for me, it was exactly the opposite. And maybe it's just the wiring. It's liberating and energizing to know both of those things, because it makes you understand your place, and it makes every moment in some ways more precious if you understand that there's nothing guiding it, and there's no and that you're here for a short time, and you're dealt a set of cards, and that's life, and you might as well use it.
Well, you're made of more resilient stuff than me. Somebody did right by you leading up to that point, or somebody's nutrient levels when you were a fetus did right by you. But yeah, that's the notion. I mean, this is I just agreed to blurb a manuscript for a book of a scientist who experienced just a horrendous nightmarish family tragedy. And the book is about like how he has found comfort in science. And I sure can't wait to read it, because like, how'd he do that? Science just seemed like the only intellectually sustainable default state to try to understand things, but it sure does not give comfort much.
Yeah, well, I guess again, it's all in the attitude. I since we're both atheists in that sense, but I obviously, for some reason or other, I've been labeled it's higher in my profile, and because I've spent time trying to protect things like the teaching of evolution in schools, and got involved in that because the biologists weren't doing it enough, in my opinion. That's why.
You're right. You died for our sins trying to fight creationism.
But because of that, I spent a lot of time talking to people about this issue, and I do think that realizing, one talks about loss of faith, and even that's already propaganda, or that's already promoting a reality that doesn't need to be. It's not a lot. You don't lose anything. You gain, I think. And if you indicate people that you can gain by making recognizing every moment's more precious, if you have that mentality and you recognize it, then you don't have to, then you gain. Anyway, I think that's the kind of, if I'm going to do a feel good or try to be I don't try to be advice or one of those kind of advice scientists, but if I did, I mean, that's what I think. That's the argument, and I'm going to try and argue it later on. I struggled a lot with the last half of this book, because I could see your angst. We'll get to it, but I think I can see a happy way out, and maybe it isn't, but we'll see if you think about it.
Well, I think I finally. It took me like a huge amount of time to get to the end there, because like, how can this not just be, well, this sucks and is pretty demoralizing, but we're adults. That's the way the world. To see that there is actually a good feature of it and a liberating one. I sure can't convince myself of it most of the time. And not only did I write the damn book, I read it even at various points.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hard pull, but it's kind of it's reminding me of that great rebranding that atheism has tried to do in recent years. We are not just about what isn't. We are not just a theist. We're not just like saying, I don't believe there's a God, and as long as we're at it, I don't believe there's an Easter bunny. No, it's a positive, and the whole rebranding is humanism. And to be able to say, like, the source of human goodness is human, uh, that's not just saying, it wasn't in 7 days that the world got created, and like smoting is probably not a good thing most of the time. Yeah, there's rooms for positivity in there.
Yeah, I think. Well, I think I think, as I'll argue, as and I was reminded of a quote from my late friend Christopher Hitchens here. I mean, I don't think we have a choice, ultimately, and I think that we should, I'm getting ahead of myself, but in some sense, part of the last part of the book is saying, well, how can we wanting there to be free will and believing their free will is so ingrained. How can we get over it? But I think we just recognize that not thinking in terms of free will is just part of the way we're wired too, and that's we don't have the choice to not emotionally want there to be free will. We don't have any choice. I'll agree with you there, but we can intellectually through learning, I'll argue at some level, recognize rationally that there isn't. But I think recognizing that we don't have the free will to not emotionally believe in free will is just something we have to accept, I think, and should not struggle with.
To some extent, I mean, Robert Trivers, like one of the pioneering sociobiologists, during one period got very interested and published some stuff on the evolution of the capacity for self-deception.
Yeah.
Essentially saying, if you're going to have a species that can know the future, like the only way you're going to get up in the day is the ability for self-deception. Interestingly, equally interesting is the notion that evolution of self-deception, because the best way to convince people of your lies is to believe your lies, and competition and all of that. So he got very interested in that. But just the very notion that if you're going to be this smart, it's a pretty helpful thing.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I always say every one of us has to believe 6 impossible things for our breakfast just to get up. You like your colleagues, you like your job, you like where you live, your spouse, whatever it is. But you just got to get out of bed, and that's okay. I mean, but a great thing is to recognize it's okay to recognize it's an illusion, but to recognize it doesn't diminish the fact that we know we have it, and to say and almost revel in it. But anyway, let's get to I could have spent time talking about the last book, Behave, which is a precursor to this, but this book, Determined, is about free will. And by the way, it seemed to me not only have you agonized about it for years. When did you really start to think about it? Was it when you realized that there's no God at the same time as when you began to think?
Yeah.
And then you've actually also put not your money. Well, you may your money where your mouth is. You've actually gotten involved consequentially, if there is no free will, then there's a question of responsibility and punishment, which we'll get to. And you've gotten involved in prisons, in court cases, and really taken this on, which I really admire as well. You've internalized it, or at least shown that.
Well, before it's lauded, I should just basically say it's a totally fun hobby, because it's a totally fun hobby. You find out about some of the most horrific things that can happen to people. And as a result of that damage, some of the most horrific things they could do to other people, and like what a totally broken system it is, blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of like it's cool trying to convince 12 skeptics who are getting to decide whether or not this person is going to be in jail for life to think differently. It almost never works.
Yeah.
And it's cool to have a smart DA during cross-examination who wants to argue it. So,
That's
it's
okay.
another version of that. But
Well, it's okay. I always tell people what you're saying is just simply you have to enjoy what you're doing. I tell people that, and most scientists, don't become scientists to save the world, you cure cancer or whatever. They do it because it's cool and they like it, and it's in the process. If something good comes out of it, that's great. That's great too. But
because dry ice is just like fun to play with.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Magnets and all the rest. That's why I'm a physicist.
Magnets.
I often ask people why they didn't become physicists. I was going to say because it's so neat. Why didn't anyway? By the way, did you ever toy with that the physical sciences or is it always biological sciences that you?
Always biological and always like cutting every corner to like avoid the chemistry requirements and stuff.
Okay.
Just not my temperament. I've had to spend years and years filling in the crater holes of where I didn't get the basic
Mhm.
information.
That's okay. That's okay because that's what it's for. I learned a lot more physics after I got my PhD than before anyway. But that's where yeah, it's all right because that's called lifelong learning. Now, the basic premise of determined, um, basically that there are and you might say why is right is there so much here to just say two things. There's no uncaused decision making. No decision is made by some magical thing. It's always caused by a series of causes, which then have causes, which then have, as you say at the beginning of the book, turtles all the way down. And the second is that if that's the case, then the notion of responsibility for your decision making, if there's no spontaneous decision making, if there's no free will, if everything is based on some physical, biological, chemical process, then we have to renounce or at least rethink what we mean by taking responsibility for our actions. Those are the two. If I were to summarize, is that a reasonable summary of the
Yes.
general context of the book?
Yes.
Okay. And now, having done that, I want to unpack it, and there's a lot to unpack. Um, um, and um, and I have to say, I was cursing you last night when I was reading the last 100 pages and staying up all night. But I took solace from the realization that I had no choice in the matter. And do you know the quote from, I was alluding to it, from Christopher Hitchens when he was asked about free will? Do you know his quote? He said, yes, I have free will. I have no choice. But that's wrong. But I think if we just said, yes, I feel I have free will, I have no choice, that'd be right. Now,
which reminds me of like one of the theological loops for getting to that. I can't remember Aquinas or who knows what, or no doubt someone much more close-minded than that, saying like God is so glorious, so amazing, and having granted us free will that we have no choice but to worship it.
Perfect. That captures it. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I got to remember that's good. Well, look, periodically I'm going to read quotes of yours because I like them, and it'll allow me a chance to give you a chance to expand upon them. Obviously, not in as much detail as the book, but at least give a sense. But basically, right off in the very beginning, where you talk about turtles all the way down, you say, to reiterate, when you behave in a particular way, which is to say, when your brain has generated a particular behavior, it is because of the determinism that came just before, which was caused by the determinism just before that, and before that all the way down. The approach of this book is to show how that determinism works, to explore how the biology over which you had no control, interacting with environment over which you had no control, made you you. And when people claim that there are causeless causes of your behavior that they call free will, they have A, failed to recognize or not learned about the determinism lurking beneath the surface, and or be erroneously concluded that the rarefied aspects of the universe that do work indeterministically can explain your character, morals, and behavior. Now, so the point is, it's to say that things are deterministic is fine, and then it'd be a very short book. And a lot of people have written not so short books that basically don't say any more than that. And I won't allude to some of those people. But you want to talk about the biology of this, and I think that the neurobiology of it, and I think that's what makes it incredibly enlightening to learn about this. But you basically come down to say, okay, you need to look at all of science to do this, and as a generalist, it fits in your sort of natural predilections. Crucially, all these disciplines, and you talk about many disciplines, collectively negate free will because they are all interlinked, constituting the same ultimate body of knowledge. If you talk about the effects of neurotransmitters on behavior, you are also implicitly talking about the genes that specify the construction of those chemical messengers and the evolution of those genes. The field of neurochemistry, genetics, and evolutionary biology can't be separated. And it goes on. So this notion that there's this biological basis requires us, and we'll talk about each of those aspects particularly, but logically, you frame the argument as there's sort of four complementary ways of thinking, and I want to get you sort of to elaborate on that. You say, well, you have a choice. The world is deterministic and there's no free will. The world is deterministic and there is free will. The world is not deterministic and there's no free will. And the world is not deterministic and there is free will. So we're gonna unpack those more carefully. But do you want to give it a sort of an expansion of those of each of those areas and what the central concepts of why there are fallacies in some and not others?
Yeah. And 2x2 matrix where two of the four are a lot more interesting than the other two. One of them makes no sense at all, which is the world is not deterministic, but you don't have free will. And I don't quite know how you get there. And I don't think I've read anyone that's just making sure, like, fill out the matrix there.
Yeah.
There is not determinism and there is free will is this somewhat off in the ozone view of libertarian philosophy, libertarian in an intellectual sense rather than political. Mm-hmm. And I got pulled into reading any of this philosophy stuff kicking and screaming, but it appears to be like a very minority view. The most common one is that, it's a deterministic world. I'm not a Luddite, I'm not a whatever, yet there's like atoms and we're made of cells and like there's rules to the physical universe and stuff, but somehow that's compatible with us still having free will. And this compatibilism one is what I spend like most of the book tearing my hair out, because what the polls show is 95% of philosophers say that they are deterministic compatibilists. And like a shocking number of neuroscientists, when you really back them up in a corner and you try to get them to look at what it is that they just said or advocated. But it's this notion that, of course, like I'm a modern 21st century, all of that. And we're made of stuff and the universe has rules and all that. But somehow, there's room for this intangible thing to still be lurking in there. And that's the essence. That's the us of us. And that's the us of us that gives us agency. And of course, the fourth truly lunatic fringe version of the matrix is the one that I'm saying, which is it's a completely deterministic world and there's no free will whatsoever. Compatibilism is incompatible with the way the world works.
Okay, great. And a premise which I agree with as a physicist. And it was, so I have we'll get to some of the physical arguments, but it's for me, it's wonderful to see the biological basis as well. But as a physicist, it seems to me that's clear. It's certainly interesting that 90% of we'll get to it. We'll get to the fact that we spend a lot of time. It doesn't say much about philosophy, which is fine because, and by the way, it's not just me. Some people think I trash philosophy too much, but I, again, was talking to Peter Singer, who's a philosopher, and it was fun. It was fun to see him trash philosophy because a lot of philosophers talk about how animals don't have rights because it's clear they don't have rights. I mean, as if there's, and we'll get to it, but it's almost low hanging fruit in some ways to see the arguments that are presented. Okay, that's great. That put things in context. But you actually mentioned, and I think it's worthwhile saying, what do you mean by free will and what do you mean by determinism? The next thing you talk about that, and so I'll give you a chance to sort of briefly explain what you mean by free will and what you mean by determinism.
Well, this is where everybody spends half the conference on arguing about definitions and stuff. But I think, well, maybe the place to start defining free will is what it's not, even though lots of people go for this. Mm-hmm. And this is a super influential way of seeing free will where there isn't, because it's what runs through the entire criminal justice system. You got somebody on trial, and essentially trials revolve around three questions. Did this person, after they figure out what the person did the person intend to do it? Did they know what the consequences were likely to be? And did they understand that there were alternatives? They could have done something else. And if the answer to those are yes, that's it. The person showed free will and lock them up. And an equivalent myopia has run through sort of one field of neurobiologists thinking about free will. And this is from this landmark famous experiment in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet. And you read any damn paper on the biology, and by the second paragraph, out comes Libet, and you want to scream. Libet's the one who's done that study. That's the famous one. He sat people down and basically said, here, do this behavior and do it whenever you feel like it. Press this button and, whenever you feel like it. And we're going to hook you up to all sorts of modern ways to see what's going on in your brain and your muscles and all of that. And out of it came this incredible finding. So you put people in there and you're monitoring what's happening in their brains when they decide to do something. And what they reported was at the moment that someone said, that's when I got the intention to press the button, you could already tell from their brain, up to a few seconds before, that they had decided to push the button. Oh my God, everybody learned. Neuroscientists have just shown your brain knows before you do, with, of course, this ridiculous dichotomy there. But people have been fighting about it ever since. Can you tell the difference between when you intend to do something and when you know that you intend to do it? And was there a better way of measuring the milliseconds? And there's still papers being published saying things like Libet had his head up as he was so wrong. 40 years later, people are still fighting over it because it's essentially the question of when you believe you intend to do something, has this imaginary separate construct, your brain already decided to do it. And both in that route and in the courtroom, that's the most ridiculously useless thing to do, because the metaphor I use, it's like trying to review a movie based on only seeing the last 3 minutes of it. Because whether it's in the courtroom or whether it's hanging with Libet and his detractors, in both cases, you're not asking the critical question. Yes, the guy intended to do this and knew he could have done other. Yes, the person did or didn't intend before this part of their brain had a bunch of action potentials. Where did that intent come from? And if you're going to talk about free will, you're not off the hook if you just say the person intended to do that.
Yeah.
Where did that intent come from? Why did that Psych 101 freshman show up to do this experiment for Libet that day instead of like coming in and stealing the guy's laptop and sneaking out? Why was that? Where does intent come from? And the answer is, as you figure that out, that's where any semblance of free will goes down the drain.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Let me. I was going to go to Libet anyway, but we'll take a break for a second to talk about determinism, because I want you to explain it too. But since you brought up Libet, and when I was writing my book on consciousness, obviously I had to address that. But it never seemed to strike me as a problem, because all it indicates is it confirmed my predilection in advance, which was confirmed by everything I read about consciousness, which is that consciousness is just a surface phenomena. So yeah, I mean, okay, so people report that's what, but everything we know, it says you really don't know what's your perception of what's going on is totally different than what's going on in your brain. And so, okay, so that proves it. Big deal. What does that prove? It just proves what you kind of know anyway, that people's sense of why they're doing what they're doing is wrong. It's the same reason that, philosophers could come up and say, there's determinism, but there's no free will. Why? It's because reason is the slave of passion, as Hume might have said. Yeah, if you really want that to be the case, you can find a reason for it. But it's no, but Libet. I mean, it's fascinating. As far as I know, there's still debate about whether that delay was really there. Although you pointed out at one point, there's some evidence that the prefrontal cortex begins to experience some, I don't know whether it's an action potential, up to 10 seconds before, which I was shocked by.
Which is when they went from moving from medieval electroencephalograms on the skull to modern imaging stuff and took it back to 10. It's that point when people start arguing, can we tell the difference between intent and an urge? Are we seeing the urge? And it's at that point where you say, this is sort of interesting. And I have like all sorts of respectable colleagues who have spent a lot of time working on this problem, but it's not where you're going to prove or disprove free will because you got there for the last 3 minutes.
For the end of it. Okay. And we'll get to the fact that it's a lot more than the last 3 minutes. You have to go through hours, days, years, millennia, and millions of years. But let's just to clarify our definition. So I think you've discussed that a little bit. Let's talk about determinism, and in the context of what you mean, and maybe in context of Laplace or someone else.
Well, not a Laplacian demon, which is the other. He always has to come up in the second paragraph, also, just somewhere around a little bit. Yeah. Okay, they checked the boxes. I think I held off to 3 paragraphs before it did, so I'm a maverick. Determinism. I basically define it by exclusion, which is you look at why something happened, and as soon as you're informed enough to know that all sorts of things influence stuff that we're not aware of, that could be very distal in time or place, that could be subtle, that could be subliminal, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. It's when you look why something has happened and there's no contributing factor that requires invoking magic.
That's the key point, the invoking magic. We'll get to that. And as I say later, I think it reminds me of my favorite Sidney Harris cartoon, which I'll remind you of if you don't know of it at some point later. But this, okay, so that's the term. That's sort of the question of whether there's magic or whether things are, or not. Really, that I agree. That's what you really mean by determinism. If the laws of nature somehow break down somewhere in the middle, and given that the laws of nature are deterministic, and one of the things I hope to, I don't know whether correct, I hope to change your picture of is when we get to quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is deterministic. I think you've been led astray there.
Oh my
although
God.
It's fine that the argument is that might not be, and you could still show it doesn't make a difference. But I think you don't even have to worry about that.
Well, I was up half of last night saying Oh my God. I had the nerve to write 2 chapters about quantum mechanics, and I'm talking with you tomorrow. So you've just confirmed everything that I knew had to be learning, which is like calling me a dilettante as a compliment.
No, but it's okay. I mean, it's okay because in some sense it was conservative. I'm going to be generous, but I would say where I would disagree with you, you go overboard and then show that even if it's overboard, it doesn't make a difference anyway. So but we'll talk about that.
Okay. We could
Um,
live with.
but I do want to get. I mean, central to all of this, just to make it clear, that we, that my understanding is from your book and my other things is the same. Is that we realize that our conscious, what we define as consciousness, what we define as intent, what we perceive as all of these things, is just our awareness is just the tip of an iceberg. That it's the last stage of a detailed behavior in the brain that we still don't understand, and we understand contributing factors, but that this sense of free will, like everything else, like even our sense of consciousness, is somehow a post hoc illusion. I mean, we're piecing together a world in which we have an us and in our brain and a me, and there's some continuity, and that's what our brains is doing, but it doesn't that's the end result, not the beginning. I mean, is that
Perfect.
reasonable to say?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. Yes. Now, one of the ways to demonstrate this, other than just talking about it, the fact that reporting is unreliable. And by the way, it was I know you read that part of my book on that, and it's the experiments of Michael Gazzaniga on the split brain thing were, for me, just so overwhelming that you invent this perfectly rational explanation, which is obviously totally false for why you're doing something. But you give lots of examples because you know what you're talking about. I just sort of read a few, and I appear to know what I'm talking about. But one of the ways you can show that people that this sense of free will is an illusion is an experiment, a psychology experiment, that this sense of agency is illusory, is having people push a button when their hands are being controlled by something else. You want to talk about that for something? I found that quite interesting.
Yeah, that's the one that really pushes lots of people over the edge there. There are means these days. One like standard one is this very cool thing, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you can stimulate a certain part of the brain and make somebody do something. Like, this is not suddenly make them become a libertarian when they weren't, but this is like you could make their index finger contract no matter what you try to do. And if it's done subtly enough, you will believe you decided to do that. I mean, I've had that done on me, and it's the weirdest thing imaginable. Or there's all sorts of ways of manipulating the Libet scenario where they add like an extra bell or something, which you were told is driven by your volitional, intentional doing whatever, and where they can manipulate that in ways where you will feel as if you decided to wait a little bit longer that time before buzzing it.
It's amazing. I mean, it's wonderful. It's wonderful the control you can have to explicitly demonstrate these things, which one can talk about vaguely. I love that. And you really feel like you're choosing to press that button. You've had it done on you.
It's the weirdest thing. It's a good thing I didn't believe in free will beforehand, or else I would have stopped believing in free will. But, we know this. There's incredibly smart people who are paid a whole lot of money to make you believe you really want to buy some nonsense crap that they're advertising.
It shows how much you want to believe in free will, that you can do an experiment like that where you have this sense of agency, and it's completely explicitly an illusion because it was created, and yet it doesn't. That's not sufficient to convince people, and we'll need a lot more as we'll talk. And you spend a lot of time because you want to try and address all of the arguments that you've heard over the years. I think that you're trying to finally address it. Say, because you've heard all of them. but you then go to consciousness itself, where I was really pleased to say that, obviously I think it's right because it agrees with me, but that, consciousness is an epiphenomena. I love that where you point, which by the way, Noam Chomsky said to me in a different context, but he said, but where you say consciousness is an irrelevant hiccup, which I'm going to quote that over and over
fantastic.
again. The key part of this irrelevant hiccup, which is really central, and this is the whole part of the question, the hard problem of consciousness, as people might say, some people have said, is what some people say the hard problem of consciousness is what is the we that makes us we. But the really interesting question to me is what gives us the illusion of a we. That's the problem I want to answer. But you say something like our brains generate a suggestion and we then judge it. This dualism suggests thinking back centuries. So it enters into even, I guess, into sort of the parlance of at least some of neuroscience and a lot of philosophy, that somehow there's a separation between our brain and the we. You want to elaborate on that a little bit in your perspective of that?
And it's totally false. And just to show sort of the pedigree that comes with, like, arguably the most influential compatibilist philosopher on earth right now, talks about exactly that model with a possibility generator, an idea generator that comes, and then you pick. Then the dichotomously pristine, made of marshmallow you floating around up there picks among the possibilities based on your learning experiences and your values and all that. And like that's where free will slips in.
Yeah, no, and I don't, and that, and you, I think I want to. There's an elephant in the room here, and it's Dan Dennett. And I do want to mention that, because it seems to me it demonstrates. I know Dan, and he's been a friend of mine for a long time, but it amazes me how someone who is remarkable in his arguments about many things can be so confused and illogical, that somehow obvious nonsense like that, if he can be that confused and logical, it should make you suspicious about the rest of the field.
Yes, and just to show where I think that's coming from, like I tiptoed around him with kid gloves, insofar as I think a lot of his values come through a lot of his philosophizing in ways that I think tell us about how he's gotten some very wrong conclusions. How can he be so smart that he concludes that? This quote that gives it all away in one of his talks, and you can find a zillion versions of it on YouTube and in one of his books, saying, oh my God, I wouldn't want to live in a world in which no one thought there was free will, because they'd just be running amok and rapist and violence. And besides, we wouldn't be able to feel like we earned our prizes.
Yeah. We'll
That's why the guy is invested in free will. There's not a whole lot of people who are saying, oh my God, if people stop believing in free will, I won't be able to feel like I earned my low socioeconomic status and my abusive parents and my,
We'll come to that. I think you mentioned that very thing at the end, and I want to talk about how a way out of that too. Maybe it'll help Dan, but
oh, good.
But you know what is surprising is to hear Dan is, like me, and in many ways, well, in always a more well-known atheist. But it's so ridiculous to hear that sentence, because you could replace free will with religion and God, and he would argue completely the opposite. I wouldn't want to live in a world where people didn't believe in there's God, because if they did, then they'd be running amok. And like, Dan, don't you see the complete illogic of that? And I must say,
God wouldn't have blessed me with my endowed chair.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. God wouldn't. But and I don't want to pick on Dan too much, although I think he deserves it in this case. Is this all of this argument that somehow there's a there's a generator, or you're inventing something that no one's ever seen or measured that somehow allows you get around the problem that there's no evidence whatsoever, and every logical argument you can think of shows there's no place for free will. Later on we'll talk about that. It reminds me of the God of the gaps argument. The more we learn, the less place there is for free will to exist. It's a very similar argument. When I was reading the book, I wrote on God of the gaps at one point later on in the book. Let me remind you of this Sidney Harris cartoon, which you can use in your lectures if you haven't. It's two physicists at a blackboard. Have you seen that thing? Where it's a long equation, and then in the middle it says, and then a miracle occurs. And then one of the guys says to the other, I think you should be a little more explicit at that step right there. But it's exactly that, right? It's perfect. It's exactly that. And you have to presume magic. But what intrigued me, I do want you to elaborate on one thing. It's almost the last sentence of that particular section of the book. You say, thinking that it's sufficient to merely know about the intent in the present is far worse than just intellectual blindness, far worse than believing that it is the very first turtle on the way down that's floating in the air. In a world such as we have, it's deeply ethically flawed as well. And you just leave that hanging there, and maybe because you can want to talk about it later, but why is it ethically flawed?
Because the subject about whether there's free will at the end of the day isn't about neuroscience and isn't about philosophy, and it's about the fact that we've created a world that runs on a myth that is just, and runs on a myth that it is ethically defendable to have a world in which all sorts of people are rewarded for things they didn't earn, and a vastly larger number of people live lives of misery and deprivation and are viewed as having been entitled to it for things they had no control over either.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll get, sorry. Okay, good. Okay.
I get worked up about this one.
Yeah, well, good. Well, I can't wait. If you're worked up about this, well, that's the part of the book where you can really sense the emotion and frustration, and yet also fear that you're going to say something that, that people are going to, anyway, it's interesting. And the bravery it took to write it down. I think you talk about that. You were hesitant, one of the there are lots of things that cause you to take time in writing this book, but how people respond to the obvious consequences of what you're saying is terrifying a little bit. I think I can understand that. You next talk about where intent comes from, where you really begin to get into for me, the fascinating aspects of neurobiology, much of which I knew nothing about. And so it was a great learning experience for me. Also depressing, of course, because every time you learn, it's driven home, even things that the examples, the explicit examples and empirical examples of things that I might have presumed exist are depressing, like the fact that when you make decisions about things that you think are decisions, that you say in 3 different studies, subjects and brain scanners alternated between rating the beauty of something or the goodness of the same behavior. And basically, and you say both types of assessments activated the same region, the orbital frontal cortex, or OFC. The more beautiful or good, the more OFC activation. It's as if irrelevant emotions about beauty gum up cerebral contemplation of the scales of justice. Namely, you make decisions, and it's just explicit, not just where we know that, but you can measure the brain and see that it is that these external things which you don't think are affecting your rationality are totally determining what you think is rational.
Yep. And never in a million years would the average person who's just made one of those judgments saying, oh, that's interesting. Why did you decide that? Oh, it's because my orbital frontal cortex evolved that it has trouble distinguishing between the two, because it's very recently that we evolved making moral assessments rather than just like appearance assessments. Oh, that's why I did that. Yeah, right.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's true. We as you point out, that these moral assessments are recent. So yeah, all of the biological machinery was developed without that, and we've built up a morality and a rationality, again, trying to impose that on an infrastructure that wasn't based on any of that. Once again, if Hume had been around today, he would say that reason is a slave of passion. I mean, this gives meat to that beautiful quote. Which he presumed, I guess, on the basis of thinking about things, but not with the evidence that you have. And it's great to see evidence that specifically shows over and over again that reason is a slave of passion.
Well, and you used a great word for describing all of it, kludge, of like, oh, it's just this mishmash that you kind of put together and improvised, which is the human brain. Another soundbite of the field: evolution is not an inventor, it's a tinkerer. Okay, what do we got here? And we suddenly have like come up with a notion of love. Where we, okay, give me some duct tape. This part of the brain is going to handle it, even though for 100 million years it's been doing this instead. So there's going to be some mistakes. Yeah, that's exactly it.
And okay, and then when you begin to, in each of these cases, for the first, when you talk about the biological basis of trying to address this fallacy of free will, of perceived free will, you talk about, you try and again put meat on turtles all the way down by saying, okay, you have this intent. What about the minutes before? What about the hours before? What about the days before, the millennia before, the millions of years before? And I want to unpack that a little bit. You talk about pre-existing tendencies towards aggression, and how you say, above all, because of how much life has taught them at a young age that the world is a menacing place, that people, or that animals in particular, that experience the fact the world is a menacing place, respond with the kind of aggression that you might have, that's not surprising. That they don't control that. It's based on their experiences, minutes, hours, years, or lifetimes, or genetically beforehand.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that I was interested in, I want to throw these things in because there's so many neat examples, is just to show a sense that, when we talk about being good people by being monogamous versus polygamous, you talk about different species and oxytocin and testosterone and vasopressin receptor levels. And why don't you talk about what happened? I was going to quote it, but you can talk about polygamous rodent species versus monogamous rodent species, and how I found this fact once again fascinating when you think about this. What we impose as a moral issue now is biology.
Medical and biological.
Yeah.
This is like irresistible and so much fun to teach about. Voles. Voles are these little vole things that run around, and there's all these different subtypes. And there are mountain voles and prairie voles in the great American West. And they turn out, despite like having 99% of their genes in common, they have very, very different social systems, in that prairie voles are monogamous. They form pair bonds, and mountain voles are polygamous. And I always have to remember when I'm teaching this, okay, which one is it? Garrison Keillor. Garrison Keillor talks about the great, like, American values out in Wobegon, stuff that's in the prairie. It's the prairie voles who are monogamous. They turn out not to be, but that's what I always have to remember before I mess them up. So, wow, how'd that happen? Because they're so closely related. They're so and incredibly cool work by like a bunch of neuroscientists over the last couple of decades have completely unpacked that system. When you are a male vole of either species and you're mating, you release this hormone vasopressin from one part of your brain. And what it does is it buzzes a part of your brain having to do with reward. And whoa, they just explained sex feels good. And then it turns out that because of just a gene duplication event, a change in a promoter on a gene, in other words, stuff that like dead white males in lab coats and molecular biology could explain, in the prairie voles, the receptor for vasopressin is more widespread and responsive than the receptor in the mountain voles. So for the same sex act, they get a whole lot more of a buzz. And at that point, like basic behaviorism takes over. Wow, that was great. I think I'll stick around. And instead, mountain voles are nomadic, the males there, and they're like gone the next day. Okay, how do you know this? How do you know this? One of those experiments where like people's mouths have to drop open, brilliant like molecular manipulation, take the prairie vole version of this gene and plunk it down into mountain voles, and you make them monogamous. You make them monogamous.
It's amazing. Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of thing I love. I mean, you can't argue with that, right? That's what's great about it.
And okay, so what about us? And what about us? And aren't we monogamous? But what about divorce rates? And what about most societies allow polygamy? And there's incredibly convincing evolutionary biology showing that among all the primates, we're right in the middle. We're like halfway between being a classic pair bonding monogamous species and a polygamous one. And there's all sorts of interesting ways you can show that. But in terms of this, say, okay, so which version, what kind of vole are we? And it turns out we have different variants. Some of us have one kind, some of us have one another. And that's predictive of things like how stable of relationships you form. That's predictive of things like how close you stand to an attractive person if you're already in a relationship. Oh my God. It's the same stuff. It's like the same stuff that before it's over with is produced like sonnets or divorce lawyers. So there's very human specific aspects to it. But whoa, even that is ultimately mechanistic.
Yeah, it's and so and when we come to responsibility, people who are condemned for one way or another, as you point out, a lot of these things are gene variants or affected by expression of genes, epigenetics, which I want to have you explain. The first time I really understood, well, I'm not sure I still understand, but the first time I think I understood it was reading your book. Um, I never could quite understand how, but it's gene expression anyway. But you sum this up by saying, thus the decisions you supposedly make freely in moments that test your character, like monogamy, let's say, generosity, empathy, honesty, are influenced by the levels of these hormones in your bloodstream and the levels of variance of the receptors in your brain. It's just that, not character. It's those. Yeah. It's that.
Oh, all that's like fidelity, or if you're in a different society, all of the cultural values built around you should be fine being a third wife, or you should want to get as many camels as possible to get as many wives. And that's the kind of people we are. And whether it's one extreme or the other, or one of the ones in between, it's imbued with value and cultural judgment. And that's not it. That said, it's not all what version of the vasopressin receptor gene you have. And those studies showing that, and different human correlates of, it's not everyone, it's just at a higher than expected rate. All of our usual provisos there. But if you knew about the vasopressin status, plus 3 more of the neurotransmitters and 7 of the hormones and this and that, you're getting close to saying that's why this person is this way instead of that way.
Well, again, I think of Dan Dennett again was saying, you may not be able to feel good about your feel you deserve the prizes, and similarly, you might feeling that you've been a good person is great, but you may also realize that it's a bit of luck as well.
Or all the other biology,
and historical, genetic, historical. In fact, we'll talk about that. I want to. So that's minutes to hours, hormonal influence on your actions, which are immediate. But then you talk about weeks to years, really related to neuroplasticity, which I guess is becoming increasingly important, and you say, to jump to sort of depressing in a way, to read once again about adolescence and its importance, because none of us can have control. I mean, when you think about that you're doomed in some ways to act the way you are because of a period in your life that you sometimes want to just forget.
Yes.
And you say, if you're an adult, your adolescent experiences of trauma, stimulation, love, failure, rejection, happiness, despair, acne, the whole shebang will have played an outsized role in constructing the frontal cortex, because you point out that's when it's being constructed. Constructing the frontal cortex you're working with as you contemplate pushing buttons. Of course, the enormous varieties of adolescent experiences will help produce enormously varied frontal cortexes in adulthood. Boy, isn't that depressing?
Yeah, but from my perspective, cool.
Yeah,
So they
it's
know the
cool.
epigenetic mechanism for it.
But but in fact, you point out even a better reason it's not depressing. In some sense, it was a rhetorical question, because the next page you say, this suggests something remarkable. The genetic program of the human brain evolved to free the frontal cortex from genes as much as possible. Namely, if the frontal cortex is being developed during a period of learning, of experiences, in a rational, intelligent, self-conscious species, you'd want that brain function, which really is what's governing much of your rational behavior, I guess, to be as free from genes as possible, to be based on experience. So you understand the world as it in principle is, as opposed to the world that your genetic ancestors might have experienced.
Yeah, like basically we have evolved genetically more than any other species to be free of our genes and free of their deterministic powers.
And that's a great thing. It's not a bad thing. It's allowed us to get where we are, and necessary for people, for as complex a brain as we have, probably.
Well, unless you spend your late adolescence where you're listening to speeches every day by a guy with a mustache and a brown shirt and saying, here's who's responsible for problems in society.
Yeah.
Means formative stuff is happening then, and that could be for better or worse.
In fact, for worse, you point out that you talk about this ACE score, which is adverse childhood experience score, which I guess psychologists can get
Very
by looking at all sorts of neglect and household dysfunction and abuse and all of these categories that you may or may not have experienced. And you say for every step higher in one's ACE score, there's roughly a 35% increase in the likelihood of adult antisocial behavior, including violence, poor frontal cortical development, cognition, problems with impulse control, substance abuse, teen pregnancy, unsafe sex, and other risky behaviors, and increased vulnerability to depression and anxiety disorders. Oh, and also poorer health and earlier death. So, that impact is remarkable. And one might say, how does that impact happen? And that's where I may be introducing this too early, but that's this connection between genes and environmental interactions, which I think is related to epigenetics. So do you want to explain? I mean, people would say, look, how can this be? The genes are genes. You have a DNA. How can experience, it almost sounds Lamarckian. How can experience is going to change that chemistry of the DNA backbone? So what are you telling me? And so why do you get around that question and explain it better than I could?
Yeah, experience, environment, all of that doesn't change your genes. Your genes that are made up a sequence of DNA and a code, and it doesn't change your genes. What experience does is change the on-off switches for your genes. How readily you activate a gene, whether you permanently silence it, how readily you activate it under this circumstance, but not that circumstance. What epigenetics is about is the regulation of genes. And it turns out when you look at a species like us, the majority of our DNA is not devoted to the genes. The majority is devoted to the regulatory elements. The instruction manual is much longer than the DNA code itself. And what evolution is mostly about, if you want to get into a nuts and bolts level, is the evolution of the regulatory control far more than the genes themselves. And what environment does is forever after, in some cases even multi-generationally, make it easier or harder to activate certain genes.
Yeah, in fact, you say that when it comes to humans, it can be silly to ask what a gene does, which is the kind of thing my elementary biology might have asked, because I don't know much. But not, you shouldn't ask what that does, but what it does in a particular environment, because it's the expression, it's a turning on and off. The genes produce proteins that give instructions for production of proteins, and how, when that gets turned on and off. And my also understanding of how impactful those proteins are in subsequent things is also environmentally related.
Because some of those proteins are switches that turn genes on or off.
Yeah.
So you're regulating the regulators, and it's regulators all the way down. It's these recursive loops.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, and that's, I think, incredibly important to realize that's how, when one thinks of there's, I guess, you can say, okay, there's lucky genes, as people say, born with lucky genes. But when we talk about the spectrum of behaviors for which we think we have free will, and the spectrum of people and for which we'll have to take responsibility for good or bad actions, you could say, well, there are two components. There's gene variance. The population has gene variance, and some people do have lucky genes, and some people have unlucky genes, in the sense of getting a variant that, related to vasopressin or whatever. And then there's the other aspect, which I really hadn't fully appreciated, is exactly how the environment affects the mechanism by which environment affects gene regulation is the other aspect. So there's the variance in genes and the variance in environmental experiences, and it's that combination of those two that determines who you are.
Neither of which you had any say in.
Nine of which you had any say in. Yeah, exactly. You didn't even get to fill out an application form. Yeah. Just like you, yeah. In particular, we all realized we didn't have any say in the choice of our parents, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's bad. I mean, but it goes far beyond that. Now you say, okay, so that's basic biology, but beyond that, we go back more than just years, and more than just your own life experience, but the life experience of your ancestors, culture.
Which you're irresistible. It's totally cool. It's totally cool. I'm a dilettante in this area, because what do I know from like cultural anthropology or history or stuff? But different cultures are different. Duh.
Yeah.
And there are historically and biologically and ecologically logical reasons why different cultures wind up in different ways. For example, like way back when, traditional means of production, you could be a farmer, or you could be a hunter-gatherer, or you could be a pastoralist. And it turns out that pastoralists all the world over, whether it's yaks or camels or goats or whatever, are much higher than likely to generate what is called a culture of honor, where it's built around retribution, revenge, clan loyalties, feuds that go for centuries, where it involves forming warrior classes, high rates of aggression, all that sort of thing. And whoa, you hardly ever see that among the farmers or the hunter-gatherers. And what's that about? If the bad people come and you're a hunter-gatherer, they can't steal your rainforest. If they come to your farm, they can't they can't harvest your crops at night, but sneaky, low-down varmints can come and rustle your cattle at night. Pastoralists spend all their time raiding each other and stealing their means of livestock. And like in Africa, I hang out near a pastoralist tribe, and like they have raids on each other and steal all the cows, and people have to take revenge and all of that. Among pastoralists, you have a special vulnerability in being nomadic, and in your wealth being a bunch of animals that could be stolen. And they all evolve these similar cultures of honor. And where if you do not answer an insult to your honor with twice the retaliation. You're just like losing face, and you're dishonoring you and your family and your ancestors and your people and all of that. And that turns out to explain aspects, geographical variations in violence on this planet. Or as another one, people whose ancestors or people who live in rainforests are much more likely than chance to invent polytheistic religions. People who live in deserts are more likely to invent monotheistic ones. And there's all sorts of ecological, if you're living in a forest where there's like 1,000 different edible plants that you can use, it's not that surprising that you decide that there's like a spirit inside each one of those different plants and like 1,000 flowers blooming. And like if you're living in the desert, everything gets boiled down to just like survival and very singular things. And big surprise, they come up with singular religions. And people like Jared Diamond have done brilliant work analyzing how it is that this planet was overrun by the desert monotheists rather than the rainforest polytheists. And that's the planet we have now. But that's a cultural difference. And that one influences, like from shortly after birth, where you were being taught, like ethics come from, and who you were trying to please, and whose foot or whose plural feet you'll be sitting at if you do things right and wind up in paradise afterward. And that's from culture.
And I never understood that. What I think is important is that relates to what we were just talking about in a way that I hadn't really appreciated before. I knew that obviously culture affects people, and when I talk to people, they don't seem to get when I talk about religion. Isn't it surprising that the children of Christians turn out to be Christian, the children of Muslims turn out to be Muslim? And if there's some universal truth, isn't that a little surprising? Of course, it's a cultural thing, but now when you talk about, say, the pastoralists and sort of retribution and violence. Now I'm thinking biochemically or neurobiologically. So that experience undoubtedly affects the regulation of genes that produce aggressive responses. So you can understand the how that culture ends up affecting people whose DNA is the same, but the regulation of that DNA is culturally determined in some sense.
And like from a cultural perspective, the job of parents is to make kids who will have the same cultural values as them, and translated that into neurobiology is to have their nervous systems constructed in a way that this is what they will carry along. Okay, here's like one of the all-time cool experiments, and it's the only time I have seen a particular word appear in a scientific journal. This was incredible work done by this guy, Richard Nesbitt, University of Michigan, one of the gods of social psychology. And what it was, one of those where the psych majors like come volunteer for this experiment and we're going to ask you questions about whatever. And so they go to the psych department, and there's the lab they're going to down at the end of the hall, and they walk down the hall from the elevator, and unbeknownst to them, the experiment occurs in the hallway, which is, it's a narrow hallway, all these like shelves and junk and stuff. And as they're walking down, there's a guy walking at you. He's a big, beefy guy who's working on the project. And what he does is, as he comes past you, he knocks into your shoulder, looks back and says, "Watch it, asshole." This is the experiment in print there. And then what they do is you come into the lab, and they give you all sorts of scenarios of like moral quandaries and what would you do in response to this. And what you see is people from the northern United States, having been bumped into, has no effect on their answers. And of course, there's the controls where the guy doesn't do that to you. And people from the South were now far more likely, if they were bumped into than not, to advocate violent responses to these norm violation scenarios. And they elevate their levels of testosterone and stress hormones. Whoa, are you kidding? The American South, instead of being settled by these nice, like Quaker shopkeepers were settled by these like crazy ass Irish Scotsman shepherds and stuff, and they brought a culture of honor. And centuries later, you're walking down a hallway in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and that's going to influence how much stress hormones you secrete and whether you advocate saying, they're just an idiot, but ignore them versus rip their throat out.
Wow.
This culture stuff persists.
Wow. Yeah, it's just wow. I love these examples. I'm really happy with. It's amazing because you can put meat on all of these. The words sound nice, but the meat is what matters. I mean, that's what makes it science. And we talk about, I wrote down education here because you talked about the purpose of parents in some sense is to inculcate those values and the cultural things to their children, which is, by the way, the reason I argue that for public education, the purpose of education is to get you away from your parents, in my opinion, which I could never understand why in the US we have this system where parents somehow are supposed to be able to impact on the education of children, because and why I'm not always a big fan of homeschooling, because it seems to me that's the great opportunity, is to get people away to learn that the world isn't exactly necessarily the way their parents say it is.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Except, it's not by chance that the school that your parents are going to send you to is going to teach some semblance of their exact same values. You're not going to go to a school, if you're growing up in Kansas, and they teach you that it is time for the workers of the world to unite and overthrow their chains. And you're not going to go to a school in Kamchatka and they so the parents still get in there.
Well, okay, so this we basically, I don't know whether we beaten a dead horse, but we certainly added a lot of color to it, and the part of the book about intent, you basically say, to summarize, in order to prove there's free will, we have to show that some behavior just happened out of thin air, in the sense of considering all of these biological precursors, the ones we've talked about and a lot more, obviously, in the book. It may be possible to sidestep that with some subtle philosophical arguments, but you can't with anything known to science. And I think that's the sort of the key thing. But then when we come to when we come to the patting of the on the back, the question is, people, surely with grit and hard work you can overcome, the bad luck of your existence, and the idea is that is a misunderstanding of history, which I think you basically say, look, okay, these people are saying, okay, there's no free will. I accept everything you said about hormones and everything. So clearly there's no free will in what you're doing now. But somehow in the past, there was something you could have done that, to make yourself a better person now. And somehow that it's okay. It's somehow we can bury the free will in the past. You want to elaborate on that?
Or if you're a particularly fancy compatibilist, somehow in the future, which somehow counts in the present, or whatever, it's a notion of like what brought you to this moment, and the answer, rather than being because of what happened a second ago and a minute ago and an hour and a million years ago in biology all the way, it's because of the key decisions you made back when, which is just like, oh, good, they've just explained it by saying the puzzle is now on back when. That's what we're now trying to explain. And the trouble is, whatever was in the past once was now. And why did this behavior just happen? Because of 1 second before, 1 minute before, et cetera, et cetera. It's one of the like dodges in there. I mean, what you're bringing up also is this totally seductive dichotomy, which is like one compatibilist trick, which most people advocate, is that you'll say, okay, there's some stuff we had no control over. Like, I don't have a voice that could sing opera. Mm-hmm. I'm not tall enough to play in the NBA. I don't have whatever receptor for whatever neurotransmitter so that I've got this amazing analytical skills, whatever. Yeah. We have our natural attributes, and those are biological. Yeah. What isn't? What really matters is what do you do with those attributes? Do you put your shoulder to the grindstone? Do you squander your gifts? Do you like get going when the going gets tough to you? And that's where we've got this incredibly sort of Judeo-Christian temptation to say that is the playground of free will and judgment. It's what we do with what we were gifted or cursed. That's the measure of a person. And that's so destructive. I mean, like it's got a nice namby-pamby liberal version of it, which is when your kid does something good, don't tell them, oh, you must be so smart. Say, oh, you must have worked so hard, because you're fueling that side of the dichotomy. And that's a good thing because that has instrumental value, not because it has moral value. But it's this huge dichotomy that the natural attributes we have are made out of atoms. And whether you show backbone in a moment of temptation, that's the stuff that's made out of the fairy dust. And what you do with what you got, what you do with those crossroads and splits in the road and all those things is made of the same stuff, because it's that frontal cortex of yours that decides, are you going to show impulse control? Or are you going to do long-term planning? And it's the exact same. How did you get the frontal cortex that you have because of 1 second ago and 1 minute ago and all of that? And that's why at some point, somebody is going to decide to rob the liquor store. And instead, somebody is going to decide to devote their life to Doctors Without Borders or something.
Exactly. The point that somehow accepting that the instantaneous moment of what you're, that your local intent at that moment is biological control, but somehow what determined your local intent, which was earlier, isn't biologically determined. It's that irrationality. You do give to pick again on dead horse, you pick on Dan Dennett a lot. But basically he says that. He says, so, when he argued with someone that we have no control over the biology or the environment thrown at us, Dennett's response was, so what? The point I think you're missing is that our autonomy is something one grows into. It's a process that's initially entirely beyond one's control. But back when it was happening, it was the same biology, so it wasn't anymore. And as one matures, one learns, one's being able to control more and more of one's activities. But the whole point is, you just learned that you don't control. I mean, you don't control them. You control them, but your control over that was determined.
Because was once is.
Yeah, exactly. Was once is. It's so clear when one puts it that way. I guess I don't see it. I think the fundamental question, and as a physicist, this is why as a physicist, I guess I never have found this whole issue, it seemed to be clear, is that fundamentally everything is determined by a combination of nature, which is biology, physics, and chemistry. And none of those have fairy dust in them, not even physics. We'll get to it. And once you recognize that, then it's clear that free will must be an illusion, because the physics and chemistry, I know the physics, I know the chemistry a little bit, and the biology less. All of them behave with rules of science that don't allow for that, that gap in that Sidney Karras cartoon.
Yeah, exactly. And an awful lot of people work very, very hard and begin to have almost evangelical incoherence at points where they still manage to pull that out of the hat. There's still a special essence that doesn't obey those rules.
Well, it's to me, it's very related. Again, having spent a lot of time thinking recently about consciousness, to the same argument as where is the you that exists beyond your brain? I mean, it's the same really argument, isn't it? In some sense, it's where can that be? If this is what there is, so where's the you if it's not there? And if it's beyond there, then somehow you're invoking some fairy dust to assume that you is an independent existence.
And the version of that like makes us wet our pants the most is So when someone dies, there's no them anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's enough to make almost anyone who rejects free will feel a little bit like queasy and dizzy at that point. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, and you've heard this, my argument, and people always say, what happened to it? And the argument, which I didn't invent myself, but first was told to me, is, what was it like before you were born? Just imagine what it was like before you were born. And then, but okay, let's talk about but you are here and you spend some time on the cognitive prefrontal cortex, which is so important to learning and socialization and sociality, and how those things are evolved. And you talk about the social PFC, the that that basically there's the prefrontal cortex is sort of a control I don't know whether you want to think of it as a control mechanism, but it does two things, right? It kind of inhibits. It either encourages or inhibits in the right, quote unquote, right moment. So you want to discuss that a little bit? I guess the key thing I learned about from your is this two parts of the PFE, and I love saying these things because they make me sound so literate biologically. Now I forget the words almost immediately. That's why I didn't become a biologist early on, is I couldn't memorize words. I was awful at it. But there's the dorsolateral PFC, and then there's the ventromedial PFC, and there's sort of the yin and yang, the devil and the angel on the side of you. Why don't you talk about that?
and by the way, I probably didn't become a physicist because I couldn't understand the concepts. So you couldn't memorize the jargon, but
oh well, whatever. Yeah, it was just
okay.
you could have if you wanted to. Anyway,
Lateral. Let's call it the eggheady part of your prefrontal cortex, and the ventral medial, your emotional, over the top, like hysterical part. Ventral medial prefrontal cortex is the means by which the more emotional parts of your brain, the limbic system, funnel all of their opinions and quirks and yearnings and legitimate aspirations and stuff, and send that information onto the frontal cortex. That's how your frontal cortex is figuring out what your gut is telling you, what biases are about to make you make a totally unfair decision. It's the ways in which decision making is influenced by emotion. And that's been a major revolution for the field of figuring out, no, it's not just your like gleaming calculator of a prefrontal cortex that's telling the limbic system, now's the time to give the person flowers. Now's not the time to do whatever because you're going to regret it. That there's as much flow of information from the emotional part of the brain to this eggheady part of the brain. So the ventral medial, the emotional part of the prefrontal cortex, is getting that information, and amid lots of other areas of the brain there that fumfer around and confer and compare and contrast and whatever, it's ultimately the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that's the decider, that sends out a message that is 4 or 5 steps away from your muscles, that sends out a message that's 4 or 5 steps away from telling your muscles not to do that, raising issues of free won't as well as free will. Mm-hmm. And these two areas of the brain are like very pertinent to this. Big surprise, the cortex was the last part of the brain to fully evolve evolutionarily. The prefrontal cortex was the last part of the cortex to evolve. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was the last part of the prefrontal cortex to evolve. And we proportionally have more of it than any other species out there. So that's where your Calvinistic backbone dwells, or your turpitude or whatever. And it's the same thing. What kind of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex do you have today? It depends. It depends on what happened a second ago and a million years ago and all of that, because stress and stimulation and certain gene variants and the levels of this hormone and the levels of that nutrient and certain cultural produce different kinds of dorsolateral prefrontal cortices. And this is not just, this has to be the case for more, like go do imaging and look at the size of these in different people, and it reflects all sorts of logical stuff. People who were much better at like doing the right thing when it's the harder thing to do, you go and look, and they have a bigger and or a more energetic dorsolateral prefrontal cortex than other people. Damage the prefrontal cortex, and you get somebody who can even sit there and tell you the difference between right and wrong. And nonetheless, at every juncture, they're going to do the impulsive, disastrous thing. And just to kind of stop you in your tracks, depending on the study, 25 to 75% of the men in this country on death row have a history of concussive head trauma to that part of the brain.
Wow.
We're talking machines here.
Yeah.
We're not talking souls.
Yeah, well, that's right, and wow, that's power. That's amazingly powerful. Speaking of the PFC and the experience that you've had, there was a quote here that made me think. Well, a lot of quotes made me think. You say all the individual pieces of these findings follow. So, socioeconomic status predicts how much a young child's DLPFC, which is that whatever it's called.
The egghead part.
Yeah, the egghead part activates and recruits other brain regions during an executive task. It predicts more responsiveness of the amygdala to physical or social threats, a stronger activation signal carrying this emotional response to the PFC by the VM-PFC, which is the emotional part of the PFC, I guess. And such status predicts every possible measure of function in kids. Naturally lower socioeconomic status predicts worse PFC development. This does smack when a buzzword now is called white privilege, which I have issues with at some level, but we won't go there. But this does suggest, I mean, there is privilege, and it's undeniable. What it doesn't suggest is that somehow it suggests the world isn't fair, but it doesn't say that you can cure that by then doing something else, because it just says, you're stuck with the experience of your past, and suddenly, society doing these other things is not necessarily going to solve your particular problems.
Here is where I have to disagree strongly.
Okay, good.
Because as it's turning out, very little in your brain is irreversible. That's this whole field of neuroplasticity.
Yes.
And when you look at how change occurs, an incredibly dramatic change, and explanations for why 1 out of every 10 or 100,000 of kids who grow up in some appalling circumstance wind up not having that profile, and blah, blah, all of that. Change happens. Massive amounts of change can happen. And when you look at how that works, it's exactly as mechanistic as everything else. That reinforces the belief that we don't have free will, rather than doing exactly the opposite.
No, in fact, we're not in agreement, because I guess what I wanted to say is that appropriately, in fact, that's my out at the last part of this book. I'm going to argue that appropriately treating the world as if we have free will, understanding that we don't have free will allow the kind of positive change that is necessary, even personal positive change. We'll get there. The possibility of change and how you do it can only be effectively done when you understand the mechanisms that imply we don't have free will. If you want to understand how to affect, we talk about we don't have the ability to determine what we wish in some ways, but with that knowledge, we can, I think, allow future development that may change what we wish. So we'll get there. And I think that's really important. But I guess what I was saying is that some of the societal solutions that are proposed, there's inequities, and there are built-in inequities in the world, and you're right, we should be trying to address those in a realistic way. And a realistic way means thinking about the science, and not thinking about airy-fairy, wonderful, imaginary solutions. I guess that's my
let alone nationalistic myths of equal opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. You got it. Anyway, so I think that I love your summary. The part of basically the takeaway is that it's impossible to successfully, exactly. This is what I was I was looking for this quote, and was right in front of me. It's impossible to successfully wish what you're going to wish for. This chapter's punchline is that it's impossible to successfully will yourself to have more willpower, and that it isn't a great idea to run the world on the belief that people can and should. And that's important, but I want to come back to that, because I think that does leave this loophole that while you can't successfully will yourself to have more willpower, what you can do is potentially, with that knowledge and the recognition that people can learn and change, you can imagine ways to, in the future, adjust yourself to have characteristics that you might prefer to have. And,
exactly.
and that's really important. But you can only do it if you realize the real science behind it, which is that you don't do it by just strength of character. You do it by thinking of the kind of things that change people for better or worse. And so I think that's really important.
And if in addition to that, you're lucky enough to wind up in life where you can listen to a lecture.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point. I mean, learning actually works. Otherwise, you and I, if we didn't think that, I don't think you and I would have been doing what we might have anyway. But we, it's that aha experience. In fact, somewhere in the book, you say how devastating it is to find something you fundamentally believe in is wrong. And I've always said I found it the most energizing thing in the world. I hope everyone, my goal in higher education is that every student has something that they fundamentally believe is central to their being proved to be wrong. And that's the purpose of education, I think, because it opens your mind.
Well, I think, as I said before, you're made of more resilient stuff than me. So good going.
Maybe. Yeah. Well, yeah. Maybe in that aspect, but I'm still, I still envy all the other aspects of you. Anyway, and I find them remarkable in ways. I always find when people do things that I couldn't think of even doing in principle, and you're full of that. But anyway, okay, enough of that. Okay, I want to get to chaos and determinism, and then I want to get to sort of the emotional heart of this, which is responsibility in the second half of your book. But the argument, it comes down to this. Okay, people say, yeah, all that's true, but nature has these weird characteristics, and one is chaos, that the world is chaotic and unpredictable, and there's the out. There's the magic out, because the world is unpredictable, either because when you ever have more than two bodies, and as you described nicely here, you have chaotic systems. You can't predict the future of a three-body system, which is amazing when you think about it. It just, the first time I learned that was amazing. And I will give a plug, by the way. Timothy Palmer wrote a book called something of doubt, which I just actually he's a physicist, he's a climatologist. It's a great book on chaos and understanding its implications for not just climate science, but behavior and all sorts of other things. I highly recommend you take a look at it.
I don't know if you saw it, but in some recent issue of Science or Nature, there was a paper entitled something like A Statistical Solution to the Three-Body Problem, which, of course, I immediately turned the page because I was not going to understand a word of it. I assume it really has not solved the three-body problem.
No, statistically, well, yeah. A statistical solution is chaos, especially if there are strange attractors. You can ask, what's the likelihood of the system is going to end, which is what meteorology is all about. What's the likelihood that, and you do that by running computer simulations many times over, and you see where it goes, because you can't a priori do it. You change the initial conditions. And anyway, but chaos implies, and you go into this, that for many systems, small changes, extremely small changes in initial conditions, can produce dramatic changes in outcomes. Don't must, but can. And that's an important thing too. They don't always, but they can. And that seems to suggests that somehow there's this out. And I think, I don't know where you say it here, but basically I paraphrase it, saying not being able to. So this is an anti-reductionist argument, and as a reductionist, it's always amusing for me to see the anti-reductionism as someone who's tried to understand the fundamental structure of matter. It's always amusing, because I'll argue later, emergent complexity, I think, is reductionism in a different form. But not being able to trace things to their fundamental constituents, not being able to go back to the fundamental constituents to be able to say how a system is going to behave is not an out. I'm going to let you give your explanation, and then I want to add something to it from physics.
Oh, good. Because every single person who says chaoticism is totally cool and unexpected and revolutionary is completely right. And every one of them who then says, and this is where you could find free will, is wrong, because they always make the same mistake. They think that systems that are unpredictable are undeterministic. And that's the get out of jail free card that they think they're pulling out at that point. And there's a universe of differences between determinism and predictability. Chaotic systems, which occur in like molecules and cells and brains and societies and universes, chaotic systems are deterministic, or is that deterministic is the most like old-time clock with gears, but because of the nature of the interactions going on, are not predictable. And unpredictable does not mean you can pull free will out of that.
That's the key point you make, and I think very important, is that unpredictable is not deterministic. The three-body system is governed by Newton's laws. There's nothing more predictable than that. They're the same things that made the world, that ended the burning of witches, when made it seem like the world was comprehensible by mathematics, and causes had effects, and effects had causes. Yeah, but they're unpredictable. But let me add for your ammunition, as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me almost the strongest version I can think of this is thermodynamics. Because I can't predict, there's no way I can predict where the atoms in this room are, or what for many reasons. There's no way. But there's nothing stronger than the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, which says even it's all totally unpredictable, but it governs the world. There's a law that you can't break, and every time people try and do it, they create perpetual motion machines because they try and avoid the second law of thermodynamics. And much of life is trying to avoid it. When I look at my study every day, it's trying to avoid it. And yet there's nothing stronger, nothing more deterministic than the second law of thermodynamics. Yet it's based on the fact that I have a system that's at a fundamental, large-scale level unpredictable.
You're never going to be able to say exactly where it's going to be puffing out. But by definition, if you've just climbed up a mountain, the bag of potato chips you brought with you are going to be like bulging outward.
Yeah, it's incredibly important that it's the basis of the world we live in. Physics works for a world that's chaotic and unpredictable because it is deterministic, because there are certain things you can say with certainty, and one of them is that in a closed system, the entropy of that system is going to either remain the same or increase, and that's deterministic. That's a rule. That's a law, and a law that can't be violated in spite of the unpredictability of the specifics of that system. And that's why, I guess, where I come from in physics. So, yeah.
Okay, for the first time in my life, I'm going to start using the word thermodynamics. Great, that's exactly. Oh, good.
Yeah, exactly. Now, and just like I'm going to remember that dorsolateral or whatever PFC to make myself sound good too. Okay. We'll come to. I want to jump ahead because you point out that we have developed. Okay. So that in 1922, people would have said that, someone who began shoplifting, and urinating in public behaved a certain way because he chose to. In 2022, we now say they behave that way because of deterministic mutations of one gene in this particular example. And you point out that so in if that I forget what you say, but if free will is determined by what we know by level of ignorance, there's something wrong if an instance of free will exists only until there's a decrease in our ignorance. So it's free will until we understand it, and then it's not free will anymore. And as I say, that's exactly the God of the gaps argument.
Exactly.
Thunderstorms are God, and then we understand thunderstorms, and where's the room left for God? It's not even theologians understand it's not a good argument for trying to put God there, because that shrinks. And I don't understand why the free will people don't realize that shrinks each time we learn more about how systems work.
Yes.
Emergent complexity is interesting because the argument, and I've seen in physics, there's this debate because these people say, oh, well, particle physics, these fundamental laws, okay. But really, the really interesting stuff is the stuff that you can't explain at this reductionistic level. It's all the fascinating structures. It's how oatmeal boils. And there are things, obviously the understanding things at a microscopic level don't necessarily help you understand. And there's lots of, and you give examples of emergent complexity, in particular in neuronal systems. But it's again, it's not clear why that reflects anything. The fact that you can't trace the end result from fundamental constituents is once again ignoring the fact that unpredictability is not the same as indeterminacy. And
exactly.
And evolution itself, in some sense, it seems to me, when I was reading it, some thoughts occurred, and I wanted to run them by you. I mean, it's no great mystery. I mean, snowflakes are, in some sense, emergent complexity. You take the fundamental polar interactions of molecules, and who would have thought they'd form these beautiful Christmas-like patterns? But more than that, evolution itself, in some sense, is because you point out that the whole point of emergent complexity is that the individual constituents are just doing their own little thing without knowing what the whole system is doing, and somehow the whole system goes in a certain direction. And that's a remarkable statement. But okay, so what? But I wanted to ask you, don't you see, I mean, I see evolution as exactly that. Biological systems evolve not because they're heading in some direction or because globally something's happening. It's because the individual system sort of might be a genetic mutation, and nearest neighbor interactions, reproduction, and other things are going to drive the system in a way that may, in response to natural selection, will create an organism that has beautifully structured existence to make it look like they were designed.
Exactly. And that's totally cool and amazing. And emergent complexity makes me so happy. I can't even begin to tell you that. And it's the greatest and all of that. But this is not a playground either where suddenly you can pull free will out of it. Because once again, it's built around the confusion of predictability and determinism. And the people who try to sidestep it and still somehow get free will out of it always do the same trick that their model requires. Once you've established an emergent level of something unexpected, that emergent level can reach down and change the constituent parts. And if and only if there's 10,000 ants and they have formed like a complex society, like each individual ant now can solve the traveling salesman problem on a piece of paper. No, the whole point of emergent complexity is that the stupid, simple little building blocks are still just as stupid and simple. But because there's enough of them, out of it has come something amazing and complex and adaptive. But in order to pretend you've pulled free will out of it, you've got to assume the system works in a way that it can't, that it doesn't.
Exactly. Okay, and now let me throw something out at you that I only realized in the context of reading that description of yours, which I'm going to use now whenever I hear people throw emergent complexity at me. That emergent complexity is an extreme form of reductionism. Because emergent complexity is just saying, right? Reductionism is saying the complicated world is based on simple principles, a few quarks, four forces, put them together, and look what happens. Emergent complexity is saying exactly the same thing. The fundamental constituents aren't knowledgeable about the whole world. They're not complex. They're very simple. They have a few simple behaviors, a few simple properties that are restricted to, and out of that simplicity comes this amazing complexity. So it's the ultimate force. It's the ultimate form of reductionism, it seems to me.
Exactly. And the only reason, and it's reductionism, which when you put enough pieces together becomes unpredictable, but you haven't like escaped from the laws of reductionism. And the only reason why emergent complexity is interesting, separate of because sometimes it's really surprising and beautiful, is that understanding some phenomena, it makes more sense to try to get it at that level than at the more reductive level. It's just more convenient.
Yeah, exactly. But physics is also based on that. Most people, I've written about it in one of my books. Most people don't realize physics does exactly that. The laws of physics are not. There's no law of physics that's universal. So you discuss the laws that are appropriate to the scale at which you're exploring phenomena. And that was a revolution in our thinking about physics. And we actually have the mathematical underpinning of that, something called the renormalization group. It doesn't matter, but that it's appropriate if you're if you're a psychologist, if you're a behavior psychologist or a neuroscientist, it's ridiculous to try thinking about quark interactions. It's not going to get you anywhere. But the same is true in physics. It's not a new phenomenon that you talk about the appropriate interactions at the scale at which you're looking at, and that's just another,
and you do that because you eventually want to finish your thesis and get a degree.
Exactly.
It's like the most accessible level.
Yeah, you want to get results, and then that's what science is all about. Find a way to get results that work and that you can test, and nothing more fundamental than that. But you point out, I mean, this thing you just said, that some level you have to reach down in order to find that miracle, in order to find that way. The emergent complex system is to reach down and change the properties of the fundamental constituents. But neurons are still neurons, independent of whatever, and the mechanisms neurons not going to change no matter how complex the system there's in. Their fundamental interactions are going to be the same. And I can't help but say this. There's a whole chapter based on this, and it seems to me you must be doing it because that's where all the philosophers are hanging their hats without saying it. Somehow they're all saying just that without explicitly saying it, because when you explicitly say it, it sounds ridiculous. And I can't help but think you must have, for much of your life, had to counter those philosophers or at least hear those philosophical arguments.
That's really seductive. Yeah. And that's what it pivots around. And like I stole this metaphor from someone. Ooh, an emergent feature of water molecules is water molecules are not wet until there's a whole lot of them. That's an emergent property. However, water is made of two hydrogens and one oxygen. It's not the case that once things get wet, it's sustained because it's now two oxygens and one hydrogen.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, we will now move to quantum mechanics, but you'll be happy to know we're gonna gloss over it for many reasons, because I think it's a red herring in the first place. And you point out how it's a red herring for biological reasons, which I'm aware of, and I had a big debate once on stage with Mr. Hameroff about this. But yeah, I know, where I explained he didn't have the slightest understanding of what quantum mechanics was all about. But the idea is, people say, look, quantum mechanics is indeterminate because it has a fundamental indeterminacy that you perform an experiment and the results are probabilistic. You can't say with certainty. In some cases you can, but in many cases you can't say with certainty what the result. You can only say probabilistically what the result of an experiment will be. And suddenly that fundamental indeterminacy appears to give you a way out. Let's give your arguments for why that's irrelevant, which is basically Two, I think I want to summarize them. One, that that randomness is not a good explanation of free will. And two, that when you actually think of the mechanics of the brain, the scale at which quantum mechanical effects might come about, which is something I've recognized too, but that the scale at which they might be relevant is vastly different than the scale it's going to be cause an activation potential to, or a whole slew of things to happen to make a decision. They're vastly different scales. So why don't you elaborate for a second, and then I'll explain why I don't think any of that matters anyway.
Um, because I had never heard this phrase before starting to read about this stuff. The brain is a moist, noisy environment,
Yes.
which was very picturesque to me and kind of like unsettling and a little bit yucky. But I guess like for stuff at the quantum level to have any hope, and hope in this case comes with like 23 zeros after it, any hope of being able to impact macro events, it requires a synchrony. It requires all of these random events to be random in roughly the same way all at once. And it can't work that way statistically. And it especially can't work that way in moist, noisy environments like biological stuff, because what they're very good at is collapsing sort of the indeterministic features.
Yeah, the collapse of the wave. Yeah, I mean that's the arguments that are presented. That those words are problematic, but the idea is exactly that. That I face it because people talk to me. Well, look at all this quantum entanglement and quantum teleportation. Well, maybe we'll be able to send people from here to there. I wrote a book about Star Trek, as you know, and the point is the only reason we can do that is we have to. Is quantum mechanics is so weird, is because we don't experience it. We don't experience it because we're not quantum. We're classical beings, and we exist at a level where the quantum mechanical aspect of reality is hidden. It's an amazing thing that we humans even discovered that it's there. That in order to illustrate these quantum mechanical things, you have to very carefully prepare systems, and unbelievably carefully prepare systems. That's why Nobel Prizes are given out for these things. It's hard to do so that you can isolate the weirdness of quantum mechanics. Otherwise, it's not there. If it was, quantum mechanics wouldn't seem so strange. But it's not there because you can't teleport a human, because a human is in a very carefully prepared state of two photons where you work very hard and you isolate it from the environment all the time. It's happening, so there are no further interactions, which destroy quantum correlations and all of the rest. And I mean, it is surprising that there are in biological systems places where quantum coherence exists where you wouldn't have expected it to. Maybe in photosynthesis, for example. But that's different than brain function, which is an incredibly noisy environment, and not just noisy, but the scale over which quantum fluctuations, even if they could happen, is vastly different than the scale where the important things related to neuronal processes and activation potentials and decisions and are made. Okay, so I think that's really important. But the thing I want to stress to you is quantum mechanics isn't indeterminate. So that whole argument is wrong in the first place. People get it wrong. Quantum mechanics is determinate. Quantum mechanics is based on a second order differential equation, Schrodinger equation. Second order differential equation says if you give me the initial, and it's a second order differential equation for the wave function, not for an observable, but it says you define it here, and for all, just like Newton, just like the three-body problem, for all future times, I can calculate exactly with 100% certainty what the wave function is going to do, at least in principle. In practice, I might not be able to. It's completely deterministic. Now, it is true that when you try and make measurements, those are probabilistic, but the underlying mechanism of quantum mechanics is completely deterministic. And so the fact that the results are probabilistic is just a red herring. And the example I would give you, I think, which I think is probably, so people say, oh, maybe there's some accidental activation here that changes your view here, and that gives you an out because of quantum mechanics. The example that I think is really important is radioactivity. Radioactivity happens because of quantum mechanics. So I can't tell you when a given uranium atom is going to decay. But I can tell you with exact certainty that the laws of nature is determined that what the behavior of the radioactive system is going to be, and how many of the I can't tell you which one, but I can tell you with certainty, if it's a big enough system, exactly how many of them are going to be decaying at any instant. And so while it appears as if you have that indeterminacy, it's really a red herring. The system is as determined as in large scale as anything else, and radioactivity is a perfect example. If uranium atoms, you put a bunch of them together, are going to have a well-known decay rate, the same is going to be true for neurons in your brain or anything else. They're just as prescribed. So
I would, if you had told me that, I would not have had to have faked my way through writing 2 chapters on it.
No, but on the other hand, it's good. The fact that you were forced to do it is useful, because then you were able to discuss the things which is the processes in the brain, and illustrate those, which I can't do. Illustrate exactly how implausible, even if it were true, how the processes that determine free will in your brain aren't going to be affected by quantum mechanics. And anyway, well, we're going to now spend the last half hour or so talking about the last half of your book. It's really not the last half, so I feel better. It's like the last third, which gave me solace when I realized how much I had left to read before I got to the end. The question of what we do about this, so given that it's undeniable that the world that we don't have free will based on science, that there's no loopholes, there's no places for the magic to occur. Why do we have the illusion of free will? And why is that a good thing? You ask of that at the very beginning of this, and it seems to me, all right, you have mentioned too. There's an obvious reasons, right? Because it allows us to function effectively. The illusion of free will allows us to go about, whether we're early hominids or not, to go about living the life, creating the illusions that allow us to live our daily lives. And evolution, therefore, picks us. We don't have the choice. We don't have the choice to not believe in free will.
If we want to be psychiatrically resilient. One of my favorite definitions of clinical depression is it's a pathological failure of the ability to rationalize away reality.
That's great. Oh, I like that. Yeah, absolutely. And here's the point. When I say we have no choice, we don't have a choice, but we can learn intellectually. We can learn. Every time I'm going to say I have a choice, I'm going to say we can learn. If we're exposed to the right teachers at the right time in the right place, we can learn intellectually that free will doesn't exist. You and I can learn that. But that does not mean that we emotionally, since reason is the slave of passion, that in our daily lives, we don't go about our daily lives every day, but because we function well enough to be integrated in society, that we don't go around behaving like everyone else, like we are making choices and we're doing that. But it's the same as saying, the fact that evolution requires us in some sense to believe in free will is the same as saying, well, evolution may, in principle suggest, it's okay to, kill your neighbor under certain conditions, but we do have learning that allows us to override, at least intellectually override that fundamental evolutionary remnant. So I think the second half of your book, in large sense, is about how we understand, override, and utilize it to make a world which isn't bad. It may seem like it's bad, so if I go to So you summarize basically saying, yeah, well, I don't think we need to summarize anymore. Biological turtles all the way down. But what do we do with that? And the first question is, will we run amok? Because the first thing you can think of is the same as the question people have with atheists. If we don't have free will, then why care? Then why should we try and be good? Why should we let's just do what we do. And I'm not responsible for what I do, so who cares? And I think just like for atheism, I mean, you could have that attitude, but I think the thing you point out is that's not a natural consequence of accepting the absence of free will any more than accepting that there's not a God. If you look at the statistics and you look at the data, does not prime us naturally behave quote unquote immorally. That when you actually look at the data, people who don't believe in a God generally don't behave any more immorally and often sometimes more ethically than people who do. I want to let you elaborate on that.
Which is, thank God, because that solves the running amok problem. The literature, there's been like a handful of studies about the ethical implications of making people believe more or less in free will, but there's a massive literature on the relationship between ethical behavior and belief in deities and stuff. And it's exactly what you show, in part because a lot of the time religious people are telling you about how ethical they're being, and a lot of the time you're measuring things as being ethical, which don't really matter to atheists, and all sorts of other confounds in there. But the most interesting thing about that literature is exactly paralleled in the free will one. Prime someone to believe less in free will for the next 10 minutes and they cheat more on a
Mm-hmm.
economic game. And even though it's not clear if that really does happen all the time, but get someone who hasn't believed in free will for a long, long time, and they're as exactly as ethical as someone who really believes in it very hard. And the religion equivalent is one that, like, I don't know, I get some sort of almost transcendent something out of. When you look at people who have thought long and hard about where does goodness come from and what sort of person I want to be and what does this all mean and why are we here, and if they've thought long and hard about it, it almost doesn't matter if their conclusion is, and there's no free will, or there's no God, or if their conclusion is there's a God with all these attributes. On the average, they're going to be more ethical than other people because they've thought long and hard. And it's the doing that that's almost certainly the guarantee, because you care about what counts as the right way to live your life enough to have thought long and hard about it, and enough to have had a moment of crisis, and enough to have felt lonely because there's no God, or enough to, yeah, it's because that stuff matters to you enough to have thought about it and to have thought about how you feel about it. And that's what it's about. We're not going to run amok. If we train kids and people with as much value-laden ideas about why are you the way you are and why did this person become the way they became, as we invest in theological or agentive arguments about it, it would be, we're not going to run amok.
And here's a psychological experiment I've done. Because with the atheist thing, not the free will thing, with you give the standard, somewhere the standard dialogue, how we trust you atheists, be moral if you don't think God holds, and if when I hear that, I always ask the question, and I've done this to an audience, and only once did someone come up. Where I say, okay, If you didn't believe in God, would you go and kill your neighbor right now? And you know, and generally, except for one exception where someone put up his head and said yes, you know, people say no because they have reason, they have thought, they, you know, they have, and by the way, that's Steve Pinker's argument for why God is redundant, because, you know, if God said rape and murder was of innocent people was okay, would it be okay? And most people say no, and then you say, well, and then Steve Pinker would say, well, just get rid of the middleman. You don't need the God to say it. But I think the point is, if you ask people, okay, just imagine you didn't believe in God, would you then, you know, steal from your neighbor, you know, beat your kids, and people, you know, and they, when I think about it, they realize that it's not, even if they think it's their belief in God, even if that's what it's telling them, fundamentally, if they have reason, they think of all the reasons why they shouldn't be doing the bad behavior anyway, and it's superfluous. And I think the same, you know, is true of free will. Ultimately, if you think about reason and rationality, the behavior is going to be the same, regardless of whether you believe in free will or not. So that's my little psychological. You try it in your class sometime to see if anyone would.
But, sounds good to me.
Yeah, you know, but you give the example, of course, of Scandinavia. Everyone's perfect example of idyllic society is having problems now, but you know that there's a secular society where people on the whole are, you know, better behaved and more generous, blah blah blah. We won't go into it. You give a lot of examples. I would argue that part of the reason is the same reason I'm invigorated by the fact of lack of meaning in the universe, is that if you focus on the here and now, if the here and now is all there is, then you pay much more attention to the here and now. And
yep.
and if you pay much more attention to the here and now, and you're rational, you're going to begin to behave on the whole in the kind of you might say ethically good behavior that happens naturally. So getting rid of the hereafter, and instead of thinking of now as the all that is actually a positive motivator to behave well, not a negative one.
Exactly. Yep.
Now, and you do point out that your religion generally tends to have people treat people better, but only when they're in group. And the world is an example of that. But again, I would argue that that's not so much a problem of religion. We ran once, in my institute, I ran a workshop on the origins of xenophobia. But surely, I mean, that's again something over which we don't have control, right? Even at the biological level, the immune system is the very basis of xenophobia, right? As
beautiful way of stating it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and if it works for single-celled animals, an immune system, and you know, it's a natural thing. We have to overcome it as rational beings, just as we have to ultimately overcome our illusion of free will. It's the same thing, and so yeah, I don't blame religion for that. I blame evolution. But here's where I see hope in where it's sometimes in where you see despair, maybe. I don't know whether it's really that strong. You have a great section on how we learn. I mean, it's beautiful. I knew about Eric Kandel, but I never knew these beautiful diagrams. And it's just a lovely way of learning about the neurobiology of how learning happens. It's just beautiful, just spectacular.
And then you find out, like, this is occurring in sea slugs. It's the same molecules in us.
It's unbelievable. That's the same molecules in sea slugs and us.
Which is why learning about how change occurs not only shows you that that's not incompatible with dropping free will, it proves it. You can see the building blocks.
You can see the building blocks are exact same, and you can see how learning you can see that it's not it's not a mystery. I mean, it's at some level it is, but I mean, at the fundamental basic level, you can see how naturally it's possible for a system. And not only that, you can see how that neurobiology of learning is affected by stress and conditioning, because you can see when these, you know, how these neurotransmitters are going to be, whether they're going to be expressed or how well the system is going to receive them and respond to them, are based on environment. And so you can see exactly how how environment and past experience will affect learning as well. But you see, that's where the fact that change happens is, for me, the great hope. Because I guess I've often said, and now I don't know whether I'll, I guess I'd say I call this better living through chemistry, but which is really what's happening is thinking about how the world really works can give us more effective ways of producing a better world than living under the illusion that it works other ways. And so let me give you my thinking on this, and I want to see what you think about this. That as I was about to say before, I've often said, and I don't know if I'll say it anymore, that we live in a world in which there's no free will, but for all intents and purposes, it's a world that is identical. It looks identical on the surface to a world in which there is free will. So and what I said following that, and now I'm going to change what I say, I said, and therefore it makes sense to behave as if we have free will. Now, in some sense, I think that's still true, but now I would amend that. I would say it's indistinguishable on the surface from a world in which there is free will, but we should behave in a way that, understanding that's an illusion, but reproducing it in a positive way by realizing that there isn't free will. Namely, we may not have choice to now of what we wish to do, and this is what I was saying earlier, but by learning we can change. And therefore, if we realize we don't have free will, we can say, how can I be a better person? Well, let me think of the neurobiological influences that I can have today, tomorrow, and the next day, so that the day afterwards, when I think of the antecedents that cause me to behave a certain way, those new antecedents will allow me to act better than it was now. And so I see recognizing change and only understanding that there's no free will is a way to actually do what you're thinking you're doing by free will, namely becoming a better person.
Cool. And there goes Dennett down the drain, among other things. That's beautiful. I mean, that is our grounds for hope. And that is our grounds for like neural plasticity. Things can change. Things can change in awful directions. Someone who was open-minded and tolerant back when is now a bitter old whatever. But it can go in opposite directions as well. And understanding not how to change yourself, but understanding the circumstances in which you will be changed in a beneficial way is a very good thing.
And it's the effective way of doing it. It's if you can only do it effectively if you understand how it happens. And if you have this illusion that you have a choice, then you'll probably never be able to effectively change. Well, you might be able to, but it's an accident. And it's, I think it's not just true, and you've illustrated between, say, 1922 and 2022. It's not just the case on an individual level; it's the case on a societal level. By learning, so, well, you and I are devoted, I think, to learning. It's an education. That is a way to affect our understanding and our behavior in a way that makes not just us better individuals, but society as a whole better, so we don't draw and quarter people. We don't have public hangings. Even though but we can only do that, once again, and you have an amazing chapter on, which is scary, on retribution and punishment to show that we love it. But once again, knowing that we love it is the same as knowing that we don't believe in free will. That's okay. Knowing it gives you the opportunity to overcome that. To overcome that it's hardwired in one way, and to know how to change your environment in a way so that you don't enjoy punishment as much.
Yeah, it lets you figure out, like the joy of retribution. Okay, how much does it weigh? What does it smell like? Does it do more of this or that in this circumstance? Here's how we could turn brutally violent people into people who will be like really aggressive sons of bitches when they play chess.
Yeah, yeah, when they play chess, exactly. And you talk and you talk about it's really hard. You talk about Scandinavia, but people want to punish people who've done really bad things. But of course, and this is where I would also sort of differ in at least semantically describing things. I think you would say people don't have responsibility for their actions in a fundamental sense. And I would say we should treat them as if they have responsibility, but that doesn't involve punishment. Okay, if I run someone over, I ran them over. There's no denying that fact. I'm responsible for the fact that they got run over. Now, I may not have had control over that, but then the response to that is saying, okay, you're responsible. What can we do to ensure that that doesn't happen again? That should be the response, not I'm going to slap you on the head, but you are I would say you are responsible, but if we understand where it comes from, the response to that responsibility is a very different one. It's to say, how can we ensure, sure, if you have schizophrenia, we have to probably ensure that you're not in a position to hurt other people, not punishment. And if there's a treatment, we have responsibility to treat.
You're just you're dichotomizing between what you're calling responsibility and control.
Yeah.
I would use a dichotomy between mechanistic responsibility and moral responsibility, but it's the exact same thing as what you just said. Yeah.
Yeah. But you talk about it, and I think your argument about quarantine is a lovely one. You talk about the origin of the word, and you're really quarantining people just as you'd quarantine people who have another kind of sickness in a way that protects others around them, but not as punishment. You're not keeping a kid at home from school as punishment if they have a cold. You're doing it, for other reasons. And that, and this quarantine, which can be, and as you say, what is punishment, which is a lovely word in Scandinavia, where you think that, taking people who've done horrific things, like you give the example, this well-known serial killer, the guy who killed all those people on that island in Sweden. Was Sweden or Norway? I can't remember. Anyway, it's one of those Nordic countries. Yeah, Norway, I think. And what they did, put him in jail and put him in an environment where he is, a nice environment to live in. And their attitude is, let's see if we can make sure he whatever conditions cause him to do that won't happen again, which is a very rational thing to say. Although most of us, many people intrinsically, emotionally want to say, kill the bastard, draw and quarter the bastard, do this, and
what Scandinavian culture has produced as the response to the horror of him is that instead of a visceral desire to make him hurt, what all those interviews of parents of etc. showed was a visceral desire to be able to say, yeah, we never have to think about this guy again. His grandiosity.
Yeah.
He's a clown. He's a violent clown, but good. He's away. We never have to think about him again. Yeah. That's what their culture has been able to detour the viscera of grief.
And if we think about it logically, I think we can say we can direct our culture in that direction. I mean, even we don't have the, so yeah, we naturally might, our inclinations and our experience might not make us want to do that now, but understanding how change happens, the very thing that you some sense say is depressing, to me offers great hope. In fact, the only hope, I think, ultimately to get better is to understand how the world really works. If you don't understand how the world really works, it's an accident. If you improve it, it's a complete accident. And I guess I would phrase, I'm giving you words that may be useful, but when I read your stuff, I thought this almost sounds like the kind of thing some self-help artists would say, but I think it's true. The change we want doesn't come from within, it comes from without. The change we want is going to come from without. It's going to put ourselves in circumstances which can cause a change. It's not going to come from willpower we don't have because we didn't have it in the first place. Now,
of how to become the sort of person who is able to put themselves in a different circumstance.
Yeah. The last two things, and I want to go another 2 or 3 minutes. You've been great, or maybe 5 minutes. I want to come back to Dan Dennis about not during praise for accomplishments, which you mentioned. which I thought it is hysterical. And so, as if that's what it's all about, then what are we talking about it for? But more than that, I'm going to present myself as a devil's advocate. I don't think we disagree, but I would say that accomplishments, we don't deserve praise for the accomplishments. It's the same. We go back to the ancient Romans, who separated the artist from the art. Which when I first learned that, I used to like ancient history, and I was amazed. It seemed so foreign to me, but it's again so obvious. I thought, well, okay, so this is the artist, big deal. They would say God, God is speaking through them, but that doesn't make this person particularly good. But what we can do is we can say accomplishments can be recognized as amazing, and you can be recognized as amazing if you're brilliant, or it's not something that intrinsically means you're good, or we have to pat on the back for, but we can say, yeah, let's recognize you're an amazing person. It's nothing wrong with that. You've achieved something amazing. Let's all celebrate that. So I guess I can.
It's instrumental.
What was that?
Only if it's instrumental. Only if it inspires other people.
Yeah.
Only if it makes that person more likely to do it again. That's as good of a tool as anything. Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact that you had no choice in some level in being the person you are doesn't make your accomplishments less amazing, doesn't make Einstein less amazing, doesn't make you less amazing to me. You're still amazing to me, even if I know you didn't have choice, Robert. You really are. But yeah, so I think recognizing that. So I think, even someone like Dan Dennett can at least, say, okay, well, the book you've written, or the arguments you've given are amazing arguments, and they've convinced me of this or that. And yeah, we'll give a prize for the amazing arguments. You're the person who happens to receive it. Big deal. But the arguments are it's like what, in some sense, it's what I've won prizes, you've won prizes, but I try to have the attitude of Feynman in that regard, who basically said, yeah, the prize is nice, but the really neat thing was the discovery. That's what the great, and finding that out is cool. It's the thing, as you would say, is cool. And that's what makes it worthwhile, not the prize. I want to end with two things. This was a hard book for you to write. It's clear it was a hard book for you to write. I mean, the agony of saying some of the things that you say that are going to be unpopular or difficult for people to accept, that may sound nutty, as you say at one point or another, clearly gave you pause. How do you feel after having written it?
Nervous as to who is going to feel deeply offended and hurt by it, but at least on a local level, as a college teacher, I've flaunted my atheism enough to have a little bit of experience of the pushback that it gets. Although mine has always been very compassionate, concerned people who are saying, please, 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 I want to be able to save your soul. I love you. Your soul is in danger. Well, what am I expecting with that? What I'm expecting, in addition, is having to focus a whole lot more on hundreds of pages and decades of thought about this stuff. I don't live this way most of the time.
Sure.
I'm mired in judgment and entitlement and all that sort of stuff. And 1% of the time, I can achieve this mindset. And because I've been trying to do it for a long time, I like to think I achieve it in circumstances where it's more consequential. Should we consider somebody's well-being and needs to have been earned to be greater than we consider somebody else's? Let's stop for a second and really think about it, because that doesn't make sense. And then I can think that way, and more importantly, I can feel that way for a couple of minutes at a time before it disappears.
Well, that's what I was asking. I mean, some books I've written, I didn't know, which have just changed the way I think about the world without, I knew what I wanted to say, but having written them, they help me personally. Is this self-help at all? Having formulated this in a coherent way, does it help you spend maybe, instead of 1% of your time, 2% of your time feeling that way, or no?
Yes, and not because this has been a journey of intellectual discovery, because, oh my God, I'm sitting here talking about this to all sorts of people. when I do one of those, they're going to be on top of me in a second. So I kind of, let's try to live this way a little bit more. Maybe that's the cynical out. I once went to one of those Dalai Lama conferences where he hangs out with a bunch of neuroscientists, and he's got a bunch of his like all-star monks.
Yeah.
And we all talk to each other, and we realize our vocabularies are so different.
Yeah. You know, I did the same thing at the Vatican once, and we had nothing to say to each other.
You're a braver man than me in terms of who you hung out with. And like at one point, one of the monks said something about what they do with their anger, and they said something that was totally unexpected, and it was gorgeous, and it was something I could never have viewed the world for. And I said, wow, that's amazing. This guy functions on a different planet. Wow, that would be, and all that's come out of all of this is like, yeah, like every now and then I can do that. And
it's good when you're able to do it.
More.
But you just said something that actually comes to the last thing, one of the last pages in your book. But when you said maybe, it's not right to think that one person's needs and desires are more than another, and you say the only possible moral conclusion is that you are no more entitled to have your needs and desires met than is any other human. There's no human who's less entitled than you to have their well-being considered. Well, in fact, that's a philosophy which actually Peter Singer, it's fresh on my mind because I've talked to Peter, the principle of equal consideration, which he says is true not just for humans, you're being, speciesist, as he would say, but no being has more entitled than any other being to have their needs and desires met and not need to suffer. So what you've been driven to by this is a beautiful philosophy of, in some sense, effective altruism, but more importantly, the philosophy that's led Peter to, I think, to be an amazingly ethical individual about humans and other animals. It's changed my own thinking, I have to say, about the world. I think this argument can be extended, and it's natural to beyond humans to other species as well.
Just don't expect me to find it to be easy to be that way all the time, and don't expect it's going to be easy for you, but it'll be a good thing if we do, because
exactly. It's not, I'm now a vegetarian, for example, and I wasn't before, and it's not, well, it wasn't that difficult. But let me end with the last few sentences of your book, because I think it's nice. Those in the future will marvel at what we didn't yet know, which really resonates with me because, of course, as you know, my new book is exactly that. I love the fact that it'll be out of date, and the fact that not knowing is what it's all about. And if they don't marvel at what we don't know, then my goodness, we've made a big mistake, that progress has ended. There will be scholars opining about why, in the course of a few decades around the start of the third millennium, most people stopped opposing gay marriage. History majors will struggle on final exams to remember whether it was the 19th, 20th, or 21st centuries when people began to understand epigenetics. They will view us as being as ignorant as we now view the goitered peasants who thought Satan caused seizures. That borders on the inevitable. But it need not be inevitable that they also view us as heartless. And I think that's important. That means what you and I have been talking about together, that we can learn to change and be less heartless, but only under understanding how the world works. So I don't view this book and your work as in any way depressing or pessimistic. Just as I take the fact that there's no meaning in the universe as energizing, I take this beautiful piece of work on understanding how the world really works at the level of behavior as uplifting and a blueprint for thinking about how we can make the world a better place. So I think you've done God's work, as my atheist friend Steve Weinberg used to say. So thank you so very much. It's been a real pleasure, and I know I appreciate the time that you allowed me to take of yours. And I wanted to do well. I thought I wanted to give you the time that was necessary. I wanted to give it the arguments the time they deserved, and we could have spent longer, but it's been a pleasure.
Likewise, I hope we could do this in the same room sometime and talk for hours and hours and hours
Yeah, I'm
because
looking forward to that. It's a real privilege. Thanks again. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.